You begin this story in the calm, measured quiet of early medieval England, where the sky served as both a clock and a judge. To the people of that age, the heavens were not simply a backdrop, but an active force that shaped their fears, their labors, and their sense of destiny. When the sky darkened unexpectedly, it was not a curiosity, it was a message, and for King Harold Godwinson, the man who would become the final crowned ruler of an independent Anglo-Saxon England, the sky wrote its warnings in a way that still troubles historians. You stand beside the world Harold knew. The eastern lands of England, with wide meadows and long strips of tilled soil, were worked by hands that rarely stopped. The people lived in simple timber-framed houses clustered around a lord's hall. Their days followed the slow rhythm of ploughing, sowing, harvesting, and surviving the cold of each winter. There was no sense of rushing history, only the steady weight of time. Harold came from this world but rose far above it. Born into the Godwin family, one of the most powerful dynasties of the realm, he spent his youth navigating both the sword-heavy world of the nobility and the quiet administrative world of royal governance. He learned how to negotiate, how to keep men loyal, how to travel swiftly from shire to shire, and how to listen to what was happening beneath the surface of politics. These skills were far more important to his rise than the louder moments of battle that later defined him. Yet for this story, you are not concerned with Harold's political struggles. Instead, you trace the sky above him, for it is there that one of the most unsettling coincidences of medieval history unfolded. In the spring of the year he became king. A solar eclipse crossed England. You imagine the moment through the eyes of those who witnessed it. Villagers stopping in the fields, lifting rough hands to shade their faces, watching the daylight fade to a dim and eerie glow. The birds quietened. Livestock shifted uneasily. To them, it would have felt as though the world paused. Records from the time describe this eclipse in simple terms. They note the date, the unusual darkness, the way the sun seemed to fold behind a shadow. Chronicle writers often exaggerated battles, the traits of kings and heavenly omens, but in this case their accounts match what astronomers confirm. A real eclipse passed over England, at the very moment Harold's rule began. In a time when people measured meaning in natural signs, that alone would have been significant. But what followed months later is what gives this event its strange power. You picture Harold's life during these months. He travelled frequently, often by horseback, along rough tracks that wind through forests, marshes, and stretches of open farmland. He held councils with local lords, settled disputes over grazing rights, heard petitions from landholders, and met with foreign diplomats who hoped to steer him toward their own interests. Much of his time as king involved listening to complaints about boundaries, markets, and minor quarrels between farming families. These mundane tasks were the backbone of medieval governance, though they rarely find a place in the dramatic retellings of history. Harold's responsibilities kept him moving across the countryside. He slept in draughty chambers, ate simple meals of bread, cheese, and salted meat, and depended on the quiet work of servants, messengers, and cooks who shaped the daily rhythm of royal life. While the distant future would picture him as a warrior king, the truth is that most of his rule was spent tending to the slow and ordinary needs of a kingdom. And yet, while Harold handled the daily burdens of leadership, the sky prepared another message. Later that same year, as the threat from across the sea grew sharper, a second eclipse occurred. It was not a solar eclipse this time, but a lunar one, transforming the moon into a darkened sphere. For medieval people, the moon carried its own layered symbolism. It was tied to cycles, to omens, to the passing of seasons. When it darkened at a moment of rising tension, many believed it signaled a turning point. 2 eclipses in one year were rare enough, but 2 eclipses that aligned so closely with Harold's ascent and his impending downfall felt uncannily purposeful to those who chronicled his life. They wrote of this pairing as though it were a warning written twice, as if Harold's fate had been marked out in the heavens before he marched to meet it. You think about the rhythm of that era. You imagine villagers noticing the moon's darkening, then carrying tales to their local priest, who in turn repeated the story at the next gathering. It could take weeks for a single event to spread through the countryside. Even so, the eclipse would have stirred quiet conversations among those who believed the sky mirrored earthly events. These 2 eclipses were not the only signs recorded during Harold's rule, but they were the ones that left the deepest impression. The notion that the heavens had darkened twice in the space of his brief reign became woven into the story of the Norman invasion that followed. Harold himself may not have considered the eclipses significant. He had pressing concerns, reinforcing defenses, negotiating with nobles who questioned his legitimacy, and preparing for threats both from the north and from Normandy. He may have seen the sky darken, noted it briefly, and moved on to the next task. But the chroniclers, writing with the clarity of hindsight, framed the eclipses as markers laid out along the path toward disaster. Even now, historians find the coincidence unsettling. Astronomers can explain the timing precisely, but the fact remains that these two eclipses so perfectly bracketed Harold's short reign that they created a narrative too powerful to ignore. It is one of those moments where natural cycles intersect with human events so neatly that it challenges your sense of randomness. As you linger in this part of the story, you focus on the quiet details that shaped Harold's days: his scribes preparing wax tablets late at night, his advisors whispering in antechambers, the slow clatter of hooves on uneven roads as the king travelled from one estate to another, the smell of thatched roofs drying after rain, the muted glow of hearth fires reflecting on wooden beams. These ordinary moments formed the real life of a medieval king, yet over them hung the memory of two darkened skies. The people who lived through those eclipses could not explain them. They simply endured the strange quiet, the temporary dimming of daylight or moonlight, and the uneasy feeling that something beyond their understanding had pressed close. You are left with the question that hangs at the end of this section. Was it merely coincidence? Or did the people of the time believe the sky was warning Harold of a fate he could never escape? You return to the England Harold Godwinson struggled to hold together, a land where the soil itself carried the weight of unspoken fears. The two eclipses had passed, leaving behind the quiet murmurs of villagers, priests and nobles, who wondered what such darkened skies might mean for the kingdom. Yet Harold could not afford to dwell on signs from above. His world was shaped by obligations on the ground, and each passing month pressed him deeper into a struggle that few kings could have managed with ease. As you walk through this period of Harold's reign, you begin by stepping into the daily work of rule that is often forgotten in dramatic histories. Harold's court was not a place of constant ceremony. Most days were filled with long discussions in smoky halls, where the air carried the scent of damp wool, burnt oak, and freshly scraped parchment. Messengers came and went, delivering reports from the edges of the realm. Some brought news of disputes between landholders. Others carried warnings about local unrest, when food supplies tightened or when rival families fought over inherited fields. Harold listened to these matters patiently. He knew that a kingdom was not held by swords alone. It was held by the small agreements that kept people fed, clothed, and protected. Many of his decisions during these months concerned nothing more glamorous than market access, grazing rights, bridge repairs, or the fees owed by merchants transporting goods through regional fairs. These were the threads that kept the fabric of England from fraying, even as foreign threats gathered like thunder beyond the horizon. Despite this steady work, the memory of the two eclipses lingered among his people. Priests spoke of them in sermons, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes boldly. Medieval clergy often interpreted natural events through a moral lens. A darkened sun might be spoken of as a call to repentance, a warning that pride could bring ruin. A shadowed moon might symbolize the weakening of order or the thinning of peace. Whether Harold heard any of these sermons, or dismissed them entirely, remains unknown, but he certainly heard the whispers of nobles who believed the heavens themselves were restless. Harold's own position was far from secure. His claim to the throne, though strong in the eyes of many within England, was not recognized by all. Duke William of Normandy insisted Harold had sworn an oath to support his claim to the English throne, and whether that oath was freely given or forced remains a debated question. To the people of the time, oaths were weighty bonds that carried spiritual force. Breaking one was not merely a political decision, it was a moral and religious breach, believed to carry consequences both earthly and divine. This belief made the eclipses seem even more ominous. If the sky had darkened twice, some reasoned that the kingdom itself might be under judgment. Harold could not allow such thoughts to spread freely, yet he could not silence them either. In every shire and every hall, people tried to link these signs to the events unfolding around them. As pressure rose, Harold sought unity. He travelled across England with a small retinue, visiting regions where allegiance needed strengthening. His journeys took him through forests where the trees pressed close to narrow tracks, through open heaths where the wind carried the scent of distant smoke, and through market towns where merchants displayed cloth, pottery, salted fish, honey, and tools made by local smiths. These towns formed the economic backbone of the kingdom. Harold understood that protecting them was not simply a matter of honor, but a matter of survival. During these travels he stayed in the halls of regional nobles who offered him hospitality in exchange for royal favor or protection. Hospitality carried meaning in this age. A visiting king shared bread and drink with his hosts, listened to local concerns, and reminded them that their loyalty was part of a shared duty. These meetings were rarely dramatic, yet they held the nation together in ways that chroniclers rarely captured. Meanwhile, Harold's enemies moved with steadiness. From the north came the threat of Harald Hardrada, the fierce king of Norway, who believed he had a rightful claim to the English throne. From across the sea came the far more persistent danger of Duke William, who prepared ships, gathered soldiers, and secured blessings from church authorities, who believed Harold's oath, however disputed, bound him to Norman succession. You picture Harold receiving reports of these preparations. A messenger, weary from days on the road, might kneel before him and deliver news of Norman shipbuilding. Another might speak of diplomatic letters, exchanged between continental rulers. Others brought rumors, sometimes little more than tavern talk, but still collected and forwarded, because in uncertain times even rumors carried weight. Despite the gathering storm, Harold continued the quiet work of strengthening fortifications along the southern coast. He improved watchtowers, replenished supplies, and coordinated with local lords, who would be responsible for raising men should an invasion come. This required precision and trust. Each region had its own customs regarding military service. Some provided mounted warriors, others sent foot soldiers, and still others contributed supplies rather than men. Keeping these systems aligned was one of the less dramatic but more essential tasks of rule. Through all this effort, the memory of the eclipses remained in the background, like a soft breath of uncertainty that never fully faded. Even among Harold's closest advisors, men who prided themselves on reason and experience, there were quiet exchanges about whether such celestial signs should be interpreted or ignored. Medieval people did not see the natural world as separate from the spiritual one. The two were deeply entwined, creating a landscape of meaning that shaped daily life. You imagine Harold in his private moments, perhaps late at night, seated not on a throne but on a simple wooden bench, reading through accounts, tax rolls, and reports by the light of a single candle. The wax drip, the scratch of a quill, and the rustle of parchment would have been the familiar sounds of his nights. In such quiet moments, he may have reflected on the strange timing of the eclipses. He may have wondered whether they were truly meaningless, or whether they foreshadowed challenges he could not yet see. While Harold focused on maintaining order, the rest of the kingdom lived through ordinary routines. Farmers harvested fields, collected firewood, repaired tools, and tended livestock. Fishermen rose before dawn, pushed their boats into cold waters, and hoped for a good catch. Craftsmen shaped iron, wood, and leather into tools used by nearly every household. Shepherds guided flocks across open land. Women managed the complex rhythm of household tasks, preparing meals, spinning wool, brewing ale, and caring for children. Monks copied texts in scriptoria, where the air carried the scent of ink and parchment. These daily tasks did not stop, because the sky had darkened. Yet the eclipses remained part of the oral memory of communities, repeated at gatherings, spoken of at winter hearths, and woven into prayers offered at local churches. They became part of the landscape of meaning that shaped how people understood the rising tension in the kingdom. As summer approached, the threat from the north grew more immediate. Reports reached Harold that Harald Hardrada was preparing to sail with an imposing force. Hardrada was a figure of legend, a warrior who had traveled through distant lands, fought in foreign campaigns, and built a reputation that inspired both fear and respect. His arrival would force Harold to confront danger on one front, even as William of Normandy prepared to strike on another. Harold's preparations became more hurried. He gathered his household troops, sent messages to regional leaders, and readied supplies for a campaign. Military campaigns in this age required careful calculation. Food, horses, and equipment needed to be positioned strategically. Roads had to remain passable, messengers had to travel swiftly, and all of this had to be done while maintaining the stability of the regions left behind. In this busy moment, the eclipses seemed almost forgotten, yet they lingered in the minds of those who believed the heavens mirrored earthly fate. Chroniclers later framed this period as though every step Harold took was shadowed by the memory of those darkened skies. Whether that reflects the experience of the people at the time, or the interpretation added by later writers, is difficult to separate. As Harold prepared to meet the threat from the north, messengers from the southern coast continued to bring news of Norman activity. William's fleet was nearly ready. Ships lined the Norman shore, their hulls sealed with pitch, their sails prepared, their crews trained for the crossing. Harold knew that defending two fronts was nearly impossible, yet he had no choice. To abandon the north would be to surrender vast territories, to abandon the south would be to invite Norman victory. In the midst of this dilemma, you pause and consider the strange timing of the eclipses once more. The fact that one had occurred shortly before Harold became king, and that another had followed during the height of rising danger, could have easily been dismissed as chance. But in a world where celestial events were read with deep meaning, these two eclipses shaped the atmosphere of uncertainty in ways that are difficult to measure. The question now rising in Harold's mind must have been heavy. Should he march north to meet Harold Hardrada, risking the southern coast, or remain in the south and trust his northern commanders to hold the line without him? As you stand in this moment of tension, you are left with the lingering thought: was Harold's next decision shaped more by strategy, or by the quiet echo of those two eclipses that many believed had already marked the course of his fate? You now step into the final stretch of Harold Godwinson's story, where the quiet tension that marked his reign finally sharpens into the long shadow of conflict. The two eclipses linger in memory, not as dramatic omens but as quiet reminders of how easily the natural world could unsettle the human mind. By this point in the tale, Harold's choices have narrowed. The pressures that once built slowly now converge all at once, and the king must move with a speed that leaves little space for contemplation. The late summer of that year arrived with a kind of restless stillness. Farmers prepared for their harvest, monks gathered early apples from orchard trees, and traders travelled between market towns along roads worn by countless footsteps. Yet beneath these normal routines lay the quiet understanding that the kingdom was bracing for a storm. Rumours of an approaching northern army filled taverns, churchyards, and council halls. Even those far from the centres of power could feel that the balance of England was shifting. Harold was no stranger to war, but now he faced a test unlike any he had encountered. Reports from loyal scouts confirmed that the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada had landed in the north with a formidable host. Hardrada had a reputation carved from decades of battle. He had once fought as a mercenary in distant lands, served as a commander in the famed Guard of Constantinople, and built a life story so broad that it seemed almost too large for the age in which he lived. Now he laid claim to England with confidence, believing his lineage and agreements forged years earlier gave him right to the throne. Harold could not ignore this threat, though his advisors urged caution. He understood that leaving the north to fend for itself would fracture the kingdom. The loyalty of northern nobles, already delicate, depended on swift royal support. In a realm built on personal bonds and mutual obligation, Harold knew that appearances mattered. A king who abandoned any part of his realm risked losing all of it. So he made his choice. Gathering his household guard along with regional levies, he marched north with a speed that defied expectation. Chroniclers marveled at the pace of this journey. Roads were rough, and the late summer heat weighed heavily on men and animals alike. Yet Harold drove the army forward, knowing that hesitation could hand Hardrada the advantage. The march itself was a study in medieval endurance. At dawn the troops moved out, their breaths rising in the cool air before the sun warmed the earth. Horses carried the better-equipped warriors, while foot soldiers trudged behind with shields, spears, and provisions strapped to their backs. Along the way villagers watched the long line of men pass, stepping aside on narrow roads or gathering near fences to catch a glimpse of the king. They offered water, bread, and in some cases fresh ale. Many whispered prayers for the soldiers who might not return. Harold reached the north far more quickly than Hardrada expected. What followed was the clash at Stamford Bridge, a battle remembered for its ferocity and for the sheer surprise of the English arrival. You picture the scene, the morning sun reflecting off helmets and spear tips, the shouts of commanders rallying their men, and the sudden rush of movement as Harold's forces struck the Norwegian army before they could fully prepare. Hardrada fell in the fighting. His death broke the momentum of his army, and by day's end Harold had secured a decisive victory. The north was saved, at least for the moment. Harold had shown tactical skill and remarkable endurance, but the cost was high. Many of his best men were weary, injured, or lost. Supplies had dwindled. Horses were exhausted. The king himself, though victorious, must have felt the heavy strain of the days behind him. It was at this moment of fragile relief that news reached him from the south. William of Normandy had landed. You pause here, recognizing the cruel timing of events. Harold had barely repelled one invader when another arrived with fresh troops, rested horses, and a fleet ready to supply them. The southern coast had warned of Norman activity for months, yet the actual moment of landing could not have struck at a worse time. Now Harold faced a second march, even longer than the first, and with an army weakened by the northern battle. There is something almost unbearably quiet about this part of the story. The two eclipses, remembered dimly by villagers and written about by later chroniclers, seem to whisper about the weight of Harold's fate. Whether or not Harold himself believed in omens, the coincidence of these celestial events with his rise and imminent crisis was impossible for others to ignore. You imagine Harold receiving the message of William's landing. Perhaps he stood in a smoky hall lit by torches, still wearing dust from Stamford Bridge. Perhaps the messenger arrived breathless, his cloak soaked with rain. The king would have listened, nodded slowly, and allowed the reality to settle. His men were exhausted, his supplies were thin, yet he had no time to rest. The future of England demanded another march. This second journey south was even more difficult than the first. The army's pace slowed, as injured men struggled to keep up. Levies who had never expected to fight two major battles in such close succession now faced the grim truth that the kingdom's survival might rest on their shoulders. Harold tried to gather new forces along the way, calling upon nearby regions for reinforcements. But raising fresh troops required time, and time was the one resource he no longer possessed. When Harold finally reached the southern region, he positioned his forces near a ridge that offered some defensive advantage. The place would later be known simply as the site of a famous battle. Here he prepared to face William of Normandy, whose army was reinforced by cavalry, archers, and infantry trained in continental methods of warfare. In contrast, Harold's strength lay largely in the shield wall, a tactic built on discipline, endurance, and the tight interlocking of shields carried by foot soldiers. In the hours before the battle, the two eclipses returned quietly to the minds of many. You can imagine the hushed conversations among soldiers, who wondered whether the darkened skies had been a warning that led to this precise moment. This was not spoken aloud in front of commanders, but it lingered in the private thoughts of those who had watched the heavens dim earlier in the year. The battle that followed lasted from morning until late afternoon. You picture the lines of men advancing, the heavy thud of shields meeting the ground, the rhythmic push and pull of the shield wall, as it absorbed the shock of incoming attacks. Arrows arced through the air, striking shields, helmets, and the soft earth behind the English line. Norman cavalry charged repeatedly, attempting to break the wall, only to be driven back again and again. For a time, Harold's forces held firm. The shield wall demonstrated its value, resisting the disciplined pressure of William's troops. But fatigue, uneven ground and confusion all worked against the English. At a critical moment, part of Harold's line, believing the Normans were retreating, broke formation to pursue them. This created a gap. Norman cavalry surged into the opening, and the shield wall, once so strong, began to unravel. Harold fought until the final moments. Accounts vary on how he fell, but the result was clear. With the king dead and his household guard overwhelmed, the remaining English troops began to falter. As evening approached, the battle's outcome was settled. William had won. The kingdom that Harold had spent his life serving was lost to the Normans. You return now to the strange coincidence that shaped this story. The two eclipses, separated by months, had framed the rise and fall of Harold's reign in an almost unsettling symmetry. A solar eclipse preceded his coronation. A lunar eclipse appeared as threats gathered, and the kingdom moved toward crisis. To later chroniclers, this felt like a narrative written in the heavens, as though Harold's fate had been marked from the moment the sky dimmed over England. Yet, as you reflect on the story more deeply, you are drawn to the quieter truth beneath the drama. Harold's world was shaped not just by battles or omens, but by daily efforts, steady responsibilities, and the complex demands of a kingdom facing extraordinary pressure. The eclipses did not determine his fate, but they became symbols that framed the memory of his final year. They created an echo through time that made his story feel unusually shaped by forces beyond human control. You consider the lives of the people who witnessed these events. The villagers who saw the daylight vanish for a moment. The monks who recorded the lunar shadow in their annals. The soldiers who wondered whether the heavens had turned against them. None of them could have known how deeply their memories would influence the retellings of history. They simply lived through these rare celestial events, carried the unease in their hearts, and moved forward with the tasks of survival. In the end, Harold's fall reshaped England for generations. Norman rule introduced new laws, new architecture, new landholding systems, and new cultural influences that reached every corner of life. Yet the memory of Harold's reign remains intertwined with the mystery of those two eclipses. They remind you that history is shaped not only by human decisions, but also by the ways people interpret the world around them. You are left with a question that lingers as the final echo of this story. Did the eclipses simply coincide with Harold's fate? Or did the people of the time, through their belief in celestial meaning, allow those darkened skies to shape the way his story would be remembered for centuries? You now enter a quieter corner of medieval history, one in which the turning points are not battles or coronations, but pieces of parchment that went missing in a world built on written promises. This story begins with the disappearance of 3 royal letters, a small event in appearance, yet one that shaped the fate of estates, livelihoods, and loyalties in ways that still puzzle historians. These letters were written in the reign of King Henry I, a ruler known for his skill in administration, and for the remarkable order he brought to an age often defined by uncertainty. To understand the weight of these missing letters, you must first step into the daily world of administration in early 12th century England. Royal charters were the backbone of authority. They granted lands, confirmed rights, settled disputes, and named guardians for estates when their owners passed. These were not luxurious works of art, but practical documents written on parchment by scribes who spent endless hours surrounded by ink pots and sharpened quills. A royal seal affixed to a charter represented the living authority of the king himself. To lose 1 letter was a serious matter. To lose 3, all concerning the same cluster of landholdings, created a confusion that stretched across decades. The letters in question concerned estates along the borders of Oxfordshire and Berkshire, regions filled with gentle hills, scattered woodlands, narrow streams and villages built around small clearings. Life here followed predictable rhythms. Shepherds guided flocks across chalk downs, farmers turned the soil each spring and prayed for steady weather. Carpenters and smiths worked in simple workshops that smelled of smoke and hot iron. At the center of many communities stood the manor hall, a timber structure where local disputes were settled and obligations were recorded. These obligations depended on written proof, and that is where the trouble began. The missing letters were said to confirm a transfer of land rights from a noble family whose lineage had been thinning. The family's last heir had died without leaving clear instructions, and so several branches of distant kin came forward, each believing they had the rightful claim to fields, mills, and rents. The only thing that could untangle this web was the trio of letters issued by the king years earlier. But the documents could not be found. You imagine the moment when this was discovered. Perhaps a steward searched a chest filled with folded parchments, each marked with old dust and brittle edges. He lifted bundles tied with faded cord, expecting to find the letters tucked among them, only to discover that the space where they should have been was empty. In a world where memory was fragile and written authority was precious, such a discovery created immediate unease. Without the letters, no one could prove whose story was true. The courts in the region could not decide the matter, and local peace began to fray at its edges. At first the king's officials assumed the letters had simply been misplaced. It was not uncommon for charters to be stored in chests that travelled with noble families, passing from hand to hand during weddings, funerals, and seasonal movements between properties. Chests were often unlocked or left unattended in busy halls. Curious children lifted lids. Servants searched for stored fabrics or tools. Mice chewed through parchment when the lids were left open. It was entirely possible that the letters had been moved and forgotten. But when inquiries were made, no one admitted to having seen them in many years. Some remembered them vaguely. Others insisted they had been present at a gathering when the letters were first read aloud to the local tenants. Still others gave contradicting accounts of where the letters had been stored. One elderly steward believed they had been placed beside a family genealogy scroll. A younger retainer claimed to have seen them in a chest stored in the manor's upper room. No 2 stories aligned. Meanwhile, the tenants of the disputed lands faced growing uncertainty. They owed rents and services, but to whom were they now obligated? Should they give labor to one claimant or another? If they guessed wrong, they risked punishment. If they refused to choose, they risked angering all claimants at once. In these communities, where survival depended on predictable rhythms, even small disruptions could cause hardship. A field left unplowed due to confusion could lead to a poor harvest. A mill unused due to dispute over ownership could force families to travel far for grain grinding, leaving them more vulnerable during winter. The missing letters created a ripple of uncertainty that touched nearly every household. King Henry I was informed of the dispute. His reputation for clear judgment made him the natural final authority, But even royal power required written foundation. Without the original charters, the king's clerks struggled to determine what he had ordered years earlier. They searched through copies kept in royal archives, but these archives were incomplete. Medieval record-keeping relied on local monasteries, estate chests, and the careful memory of scribes. Some charters had copies recorded by monastic chroniclers, but not all. When the clerks checked these sources, they found references to the disputed land but no mention of the 3 letters that had gone missing. This absence deepened the mystery. Henry sent royal justices to investigate. These men travelled along rough roads lined with tall hedgerows, stopping at manor halls, churches, and small administrative centres. They questioned witnesses, compared accounts, and searched through storage chests where the faint scent of old parchment lingered. But despite their effort, the letters remained lost. At this point, the dispute might have faded into a long and tedious legal case. But something unusual happened. One claimant swore he had seen the letters burned during a winter gathering several years earlier. According to his story, a travelling clerk had mistakenly added the letters to a bundle of scrap parchment destined for the hearth. You can picture the scene: a cold evening, a fire crackling in a stone hearth, a servant tossing dried sticks, scraps of wool, and unwanted parchment into the flames. The letters, once carrying the authority of the king, curling and darkening in the rising heat. It was an unsettling image, one that captured the fragility of recorded power. Another claimant doubted this entirely, insisting that the letters had been stolen by a rival branch of the family. Theft of documents was not unheard of. Charters were valuable, and stealing them could shift power, wealth, and territory. But accusations alone could not settle the matter. Without proof, the story remained one of many competing possibilities. A third account claimed the letters had never existed at all, and that someone had fabricated their memory to strengthen a weak claim. The justices recorded all these accounts, each more tangled than the last. Meanwhile, the tenants continued to live in uncertainty. Some tried to maintain neutrality by splitting their rents between claimants. Others delayed payment entirely and hoped for a royal decision. This uncertainty strained relationships between villages, especially where boundaries ran between disputed fields. Monasteries in the region attempted to intervene by searching their own archives for any mentions of the land transfers. Monastic scribes valued record-keeping and often kept detailed copies of charters affecting their estates, but their archives held only general references and no solution. The monks wrote in their annals that a matter of land had caused notable confusion that year, but even their careful hand could not clarify what the missing letters contained. As you reflect on this, you can see how fragile authority could be in a world where everything depended on physical documents. Power was not held through spectacle alone, but through lines of ink carefully traced across stretched parchment. Over time, the mystery of the missing letters grew larger than the letters themselves. Some began to wonder why 3 documents concerning the same matter had vanished together. Others questioned whether a deliberate hand had erased them from the estate's memory. If so, what motive lay beneath the disappearance? The royal justices were left with a narrowing path. Without the documents, they had to rely on testimony that contradicted itself at almost every turn. The dispute stretched through seasons, and soon even King Henry grew weary of it. He issued a provisional decision, but it pleased no one. The land remained contested, and the people who worked the fields lived with the daily consequence of a legal uncertainty they could not influence. You now stand at the close of this section with a question that echoes across time. How could the disappearance of 3 simple letters, written on fragile parchment, shape the fate of so many? And more unsettling still, were they truly lost by accident, or had someone carefully removed them to change the future of those lands? The passing seasons after the death of Count Heinrich von Waldenfels brought little comfort to the people living along the wooded valleys of Franconia. You now move deeper into this strange and quiet chapter, where the mystery surrounding the hidden ledger grew thicker rather than thinner. What had seemed at first like a curious footnote in the Count's inheritance had already begun to stretch outward, touching merchants, priests, and even distant travellers who had once dealt with him. In Section 2 you follow not only the lingering threads of the dispute but also the quieter, nearly invisible details that shaped life in this part of medieval Germany, details that make the entire coincidence feel even more improbable. Life in the middle of the 14th century in this region followed its own steady rhythm. Most days began before the sun had risen. Farmers checked the frost on their barley fields. Women drew water from wells that had been dug 2 or 3 generations earlier, always worrying whether the thawing ground would shift and crack the stone linings. Herdsmen led cattle to the sparse pasture land that stretched along the foot of the hills, and yet, these ordinary tasks were carried out under a faint cloud of unease. Everyone had heard something about the missing ledger, though no one agreed on what exactly it contained. Some believed it was nothing but a list of debts owed to the Count. Others insisted it held a private record of trade arrangements with towns further north. A few whispered that it contained names written in a code that the Count had learned during his journeys as a young man. Whatever the truth, you can almost feel how a single missing book had suddenly become a presence rather than an absence, shaping conversation across cottages and market squares. The first real complication came when a man named Colmar appeared. He arrived in the early part of the year, muddy from travel, leading a thin horse that did not look capable of carrying its own weight for much longer. Colmar claimed to be a messenger who had long served the Count. No one, however, recognized him. He presented a crumpled letter bearing a seal similar to the Waldenfels crest, but not identical. It was close enough to be convincing to some and suspicious to others. A few villagers considered whether the seal had simply been pressed in haste. Others wondered if it had been copied. Colmar said he had been instructed to deliver the missing ledger to a monastery in Würzburg but had arrived too late. The Count, he learned, was already dead. What made his story more unsettling was that Colmar had not brought the ledger itself. He claimed to have seen it last in the Count's own hands. According to him, the Count had arranged for a trusted steward to carry it ahead of them, while Colmar returned briefly to settle a matter concerning a borrowed horse. When he set out again, the steward and the book were both gone. Colmar assumed the man had proceeded directly to the monastery. Only upon arriving in Franconia did he discover that no one had seen either of them since early spring. It was a strange account, one marked not by bold statements, but by the quiet uncertainty that you often find in real medieval records. Every detail could be interpreted in more than one way. The Count was known to be cautious in financial matters, so it was not unreasonable that he might entrust such an item to only one person. But he was also known to be meticulous, which made the absence of any trace of the steward difficult to accept. People began searching for familiar names in Colmar's story, wondering who might have been involved, and what obligations might now fall upon them. While villagers tried to determine the stranger's credibility, the administrators of the late Count's estate conducted their own investigation. This was not a dramatic affair. Most of it unfolded in dim side rooms of the estate hall, where clerks unrolled parchments that had become stiff in the winter air. They examined tax receipts, grain delivery tallies, payments for roofing repairs, and agreements concerning grazing rights. Every sheet of parchment was inspected by candlelight. Each new clerk assigned to the task found himself struggling to stay alert, because the work required comparing entries that differed only by a single word or by the slightly altered spelling of a name. Yet these tiny differences mattered. They could reveal whether a particular tribute had been collected, or whether fields by the riverbank had been leased for 1 year or 2. In these tedious details, the mystery of the missing ledger seemed to shift. It no longer looked like a simple case of misplacement. Instead, it appeared that the Count's finances had been arranged in ways that few of the clerks had fully understood. That confusion did not lead directly to suspicion, at least not at first. Instead, it fostered hesitation. No one wanted to make a declaration until they were certain. As you continue through this part of the story, you sense how medieval officials proceeded slowly, not because they were lazy or unskilled, but because making an error in recording information could shape the livelihoods of dozens of families. A miswritten figure could mean that a farmer owed grain he had never promised. A misinterpreted note could determine whether a merchant's son inherited property or lost it. This caution made their progress slow, and yet it was necessary. The disappearance of a single financial record could create uncertainty across an entire community. Colmar's presence complicated that uncertainty further. He insisted repeatedly that he had no stake in the ledger, yet he stayed in the region far longer than a simple messenger would need to remain. He slept in barns and taverns, often paying for lodging with stories about his travels rather than with coins. This made some people uncomfortable. Others found him interesting in a harmless way. What stood out most was his habit of asking questions that seemed unrelated to the Count's finances. He asked about the movements of traders on the road to Nuremberg. He asked whether the Count had recently hired new guards. He asked about a shipment of cloth from Augsburg. At times he asked about matters so trivial that villagers wondered whether he was simply gathering gossip. This raised the concern that Colmar might not be a messenger at all. The clerks, however, were too busy sorting through contracts and inventories to devote much attention to him. Instead, they focused on the task before them. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Certain entries in the Count's financial records showed payments to individuals who did not seem to appear anywhere else. Their names had no local associations. Their occupations were unclear. These payments were always small, but they were consistent over several years, and the descriptions, though brief, suggested that they corresponded to the same network of travelers, merchants, or informants whom the Count had encountered during his journeys. It became increasingly likely that the missing ledger contained information that connected these details. That did not make the coincidence any easier to explain. If the ledger had been meaningless, it would not have mattered, but if it linked distant transactions or agreements, then its disappearance could have carried genuine consequences. Yet no one could say what those consequences might be, because no one fully understood the system the Count had created. As weeks passed, you feel the weight of this uncertainty building quietly, rather than dramatically. The people living along the valley noticed subtle changes. The steward responsible for maintaining the Count's horses grew more withdrawn. He rarely spoke unless addressed. The miller who had collected grain taxes complained that he could not complete his work because no one knew whether the Count had already assigned certain loads. The parish priest found himself answering more questions about honesty, obligation, and broken promises than he had in previous years. Even the small weekly market, usually filled with merchants selling salt or dried fish, became a place where people spoke carefully, as though one misplaced word could bring trouble. These shifts spread outward, affecting even those who had never spoken to the Count. A merchant family in Würzburg received a message from the estate asking whether the Count had arranged a certain purchase of imported peppercorns. The family replied that they had no record of such an agreement. A group of stonemasons in a nearby village received a letter from the estate asking for clarification of a payment made for work that they insisted they had never performed. Their confusion led them to examine their own records, which stirred an older dispute concerning a half-finished wall. It seemed as though every missing detail connected to the ledger had the power to uncover other overlooked details, creating a chain of questions that no one had expected. Colmar's behavior took another strange turn when he attempted to leave. He saddled his horse one morning before sunrise, intending to travel east. Yet, after only a day, he returned. The reason he gave was simple. He said he had remembered something important about the ledger, but he could not clearly state what that important thing was. His explanation was vague, tangled, and unsatisfying, and yet, he remained. It was clear now that he was watching the estate's efforts more closely than anyone realized. The administrators, uncertain what to do with him, decided to ignore him unless he caused trouble. Instead, they focused on their own work. They continued gathering receipts from outlying villages, sending messengers along forest paths that were already softening in the spring rains. They interviewed elders who claimed to remember transactions from more than a decade earlier. These interviews were slow, and often the elders would pause for long minutes as they tried to recall whether the Count had once reserved part of the woodland pasture for a traveling troupe of musicians, or for a family of charcoal burners. The clerks wrote down every detail, no matter how small, hoping that something might provide clarity. But the clarity never came. Instead, each new detail only deepened the coincidence. How could one record, kept so diligently for so many years, vanish at the very moment when the Count's death made it most important? Was this simply an unfortunate accident, or had the Count intended for the ledger to disappear? If he had wanted to conceal something, why preserve the rest of the records with such care? And if he had wanted to reveal something, why entrust it to a steward who vanished without explanation? You might wonder now whether the Count himself had fully understood how fragile his own network of financial ties had become. Yet perhaps the strangest part of all is the feeling that no one, not even the clerks working day after day beside stacks of parchment, fully grasped the extent of the mystery unfolding around them. Each villager saw only a small piece. Each clerk understood only a portion of the archive. Colmar offered only fragments of memory. The surviving servants spoke only of routine duties rather than unusual events. The full picture lay just beyond their reach, forming a kind of quiet puzzle that grew more perplexing the longer it remained unsolved. As this section comes to a close, you may sense that the tension lies not in danger, but in uncertainty. The estate must soon decide whether the missing ledger should be replaced, disregarded, or pursued further. The clerks will need to determine whether the strange payments appearing in the Count's records are signs of a hidden network, or simply the ordinary quirks of a man who traveled widely and kept unusual habits. And Colmar's presence, neither openly hostile nor clearly honest, will will need to be confronted. You might now wonder what conclusion the estate will eventually reach, and whether the missing ledger will remain lost, or whether someone has been holding it all along, waiting for a moment known only to them. The spring that followed the long months of waiting arrived quietly across the Franconian Valley. You now enter the final section of this story, where the threads surrounding the vanished ledger and the strange traveller who called himself Colmar finally begin to converge. Nothing here unfolds with the excitement of a tale meant to stir sleepless minds. Instead, the truth settles slowly, shaped by the cautious habits, daily labors, and deeply rooted customs of people who never expected to become part of a mystery. As you move through this closing section, you see not a single dramatic revelation, but the gradual uncovering of something that had been standing in plain sight, unnoticed simply because it seemed too ordinary to matter. The clerks responsible for sorting the late count's records continued their work in the large hall where the estate conducted its business. Morning light fell through narrow windows, illuminating shelves filled with account books that had grown stiff from the cold. The clerks worked methodically, checking receipts against grain storage tallies, revisiting parchment sheets that had already been examined once, sometimes twice. Their progress remained slow, not because they lacked skill, but because the count's own style of bookkeeping, careful though it was, often followed a logic entirely his own. When he made notes about long-distance trade agreements, he sometimes wrote the names of intermediaries without mentioning the actual merchants. When he listed payments to travelers, he sometimes added only a vague reference to a meeting in a roadside tavern or to a conversation held near a market gate. Still, these small fragments began to form a pattern only visible with time. More entries referred to the same group of distant contacts, individuals who moved regularly along trade routes between Franconia, Nuremberg, and Augsburg. A handful of entries even suggested that the Count had once acted as a quiet mediator between merchants competing for the same shipping contracts. None of this seemed particularly remarkable, yet when considered as a whole, the pattern hinted at something much larger than the local population had ever realized. It became clear that the Count's influence extended well beyond the wooded valley where he lived. He maintained relationships with people who traveled far more widely than any of his neighbors ever would. A growing number of clerks believed that the missing ledger had served as the central record, connecting all these scattered dealings, not because of its contents alone, but because the Count himself had treated it differently from all his other writings. He had kept it with him during his travels. He had refused to let servants store it with the rest of the estate papers. When he recorded information in it, he often wrote with greater precision, as though he wished to ensure that every detail remained accurate even after many years. The question remained, why had it disappeared at the very moment when his death made the ledger crucial? While the clerks continued their slow work, Colmar remained in the area, though no one seemed certain why. He often wandered near the estate hall, speaking to guards or stable hands, sometimes offering help with minor tasks, but never staying long enough to finish them. He appeared restless, yet not desperate. He asked questions about the clerks, about their progress, about anything that might indicate whether the ledger had been found, and yet he never directly asked to see the records for himself. This behavior made the clerks uneasy, though they chose not to confront him. They had too much work to complete, and they believed the truth would become clear once the rest of the Count's papers had been sorted. What finally drew attention away from the hall was an unexpected discovery made by one of the younger clerks. His task had been to inspect the storeroom where the estate kept equipment used for collecting taxes in distant villages. The room was small and rarely visited, filled with sacks of old tally sticks, faded strips of parchment, and bundles of wax tablets that had not been used in many years. As he sorted through these items, the clerk found a small chest tucked beneath the base of a shelf. The chest was unremarkable, its wood was weathered, its hinges stiff with age. It did not appear to belong to anything significant. Yet, the moment he opened it, he saw that it held a stack of letters bound together with cord. The letters were not new. Their edges were worn, and their surfaces showed faint marks from repeated handling. They were arranged in an order that seemed deliberate, though no one could say by whom. When the clerk carried them to the hall and presented them to the others, the discovery did not spark excitement. Instead, the clerks felt the quiet recognition that something long overlooked had finally come to light. They cut the cord carefully, so as not to damage the parchment, and began reading. What they found surprised them less for its content than for its timing. The letters contained correspondence between the Count and several distant merchants. The writing detailed trade agreements involving small but regular shipments of iron, cloth, and spices. Most of these arrangements had been carried out without the knowledge of the estate's lower officials. The letters also mentioned payments to individuals whose names matched those that had appeared mysteriously in the other financial records. All of this pointed to a single fact. The Count had built a private network, one that he used to negotiate, mediate, and sometimes resolve disputes among merchants who preferred discretion over public contracts. This network had never been illegal, yet it operated quietly enough that only those directly involved knew of its existence. The missing ledger, then, must have served as the master reference for these dealings. It contained details that were too sensitive to record openly, not because they hinted at wrongdoing, but because they involved agreements that depended on privacy. The Count had maintained this network carefully, ensuring that it benefited both his estate and the merchants who sought his help. The coincidence became clearer. The Count had died at the very moment when this network stood at its most fragile. Without the ledger, no one could determine which agreements were still active, which obligations were still owed, or which payments had been recorded for future settlement. The merchants who had trusted him might now find themselves without the records they needed to prove their claims. The clerks realized that the ledger's disappearance threatened to unravel relationships that had been built slowly across many years. It was not simply a missing object, it was the loss of a system preserved only in the Count's memory. The question remained: what had become of the ledger itself? The letters did not mention Colmar by name, yet they referred to a messenger who had traveled with the Count for several seasons. This messenger had been entrusted with carrying sensitive information between the Count and his distant contacts. The letters implied that the Count valued him, but they did not provide enough detail to confirm whether Colmar was that man or simply someone pretending to be. Still, the clerks could not ignore the coincidence. Colmar's arrival shortly after the Count's death, his claim about a steward carrying the ledger, his desire to remain near the estate, all seemed to suggest that he knew more than he had said. They decided to question him. The conversation took place, not in the estate hall, but near the stable yard, where the air smelled of straw and early summer grass. The clerks approached Colmar calmly and asked whether he recognized certain names listed in the letters. He hesitated, though not in a way that suggested guilt. Rather, he seemed tired, as though the weight of several seasons' worth of secrets had finally settled on him. He admitted that he had once served the Count. He admitted that the Count had entrusted him with certain messages, and he admitted that he had been present during the final journey, when the steward carrying the ledger disappeared. But he revealed something that no one had expected. According to him, the steward who vanished had not been fleeing with the ledger. Instead, he had been trying to protect it. The Count had grown concerned that certain merchants wanted exclusive control of the agreements he had mediated. These merchants were not dangerous, but they were ambitious. The Count feared that if they gained access to the ledger after his death, they might use the information to manipulate others. So he instructed the steward to take the book to a trusted monastery until he could decide how best to secure it. Colmar believed that the steward never reached his destination. He said the man had grown ill during the journey and stopped at a small settlement to rest. Colmar never learned what became of him. He assumed for months that the ledger had been delivered safely. Only later did he realize that the steward had not survived long enough to complete his task. The clerks listened to this account with mixed feelings. It explained the disappearance, yet it offered no clue as to where the ledger had ended up. If the steward had died on the road, the book might have been left in the settlement. It might have been taken by a traveler. It might still lie in some forgotten building, its pages curling in the dampness of an unused storeroom. But another possibility emerged. When Colmar mentioned a detail that he had overlooked earlier, before the steward left, he had worried that the ledger looked too valuable. He feared thieves might target him. So he removed the crest from the cover and wrapped the book in plain cloth. This meant that anyone who found it later might have mistaken it for an ordinary notebook, something with no particular worth. It became clear that the ledger's disappearance had not been intentional, nor sinister, nor strategic. It was the result of a quiet series of practical decisions, each made for sensible reasons, each leading unintentionally toward confusion. A book meant to preserve clarity had instead created uncertainty through the simple pressures of illness, travel, and miscommunication. As summer settled across the valley, the estate decided not to renew the search. The letters they found allowed them to reconstruct many of the Count's dealings. The rest, they resolved to settle through negotiation, rather than strict record-keeping. Colmar, having provided all the information he could, finally departed. He left as quietly as he had arrived, without ceremony, without farewell, his thin horse carrying him along the winding road, until both disappeared from sight. The missing ledger was never recovered. Yet its impact endured, not through scandal or revelation, but through the way its disappearance forced the estate to reconsider how much they relied on a single man's memory. They rebuilt the system, this time with clearer records, shared responsibilities, and fewer secret agreements. And so the coincidence remained. A book that had survived years of careful handling vanished, not through betrayal or theft, but through the ordinary and fragile circumstances that shape the lives of travelers and the systems they support. Perhaps this is what makes it meaningful, that something so carefully protected could disappear through the smallest shifts of chance. You might now wonder how many other pieces of medieval history vanished in the same quiet way, leaving behind only traces, puzzles, and unanswered questions that still linger centuries later. You now enter a new chapter in this long journey through forgotten corners of medieval history. This story begins not with a noble family or a military campaign, but in the quiet, ink-scented chambers of a scriptorium tucked within the walls of Norwich Cathedral during the early part of the 13th century. You follow a coincidence so strange and so deeply embedded in daily routines that most people who lived through it never understood its significance. It concerns two men whose lives moved along separate paths for many years before converging with a precision that still puzzles historians today. These men were known as Thomas of Ely and Thomas of Eltham, and their story unfolds with the slow weight of parchment turning in a monastery library. Before you enter their lives, you first need to picture the world in which they worked. The scriptorium at Norwich was not a dramatic place. It was a long, narrow chamber warmed only by bodies and candlelight. Each morning, scribes and illuminators sat at wooden desks arranged near narrow windows that allowed a thin line of daylight to fall across their writing surfaces. The smell of parchment, ink made from oak galls, and smouldering tallow candles filled the air. Most of the scribes worked in silence, interrupted only by the soft rustle of pages, the scratch of quills, and the coughs that came from breathing smoke-filled air for too many hours at a time. The cathedral relied on these men for more than copying sacred texts. They reproduced legal documents, transcribed sermons, preserved land agreements, drafted letters for local officials, and recorded the admissions of novices entering religious life. Their work shaped nearly every aspect of the administrative world surrounding the cathedral. Yet most of the scribes lived quiet lives, leaving behind detailed manuscripts, but very little personal history. This was true of both Thomas of Ely and Thomas of Eltham. They were ordinary men with ordinary habits. They followed the same daily rhythm, practiced the same skills, and copied some of the same manuscripts, sometimes sitting only a few desks apart without exchanging more than a polite greeting. They did not come from the same families, and they did not share the same social ties. One was slightly older, and one had been trained in a different monastic school. Yet the coincidence that would eventually link them began with a simple fact: they shared the same name. At first, this coincidence did not matter. Thomas was a common name throughout England during this period, especially among men who joined religious life. The surname Iddesleigh referred to the place where one of them had been raised, while Eltham marked the origin of the other. Nothing distinguished these men in a way that anyone considered remarkable. But the quiet administrative world of medieval England relied heavily on names written in clear and consistent forms, and it was here in the small details of written records that the trouble began. One winter morning, a clerk from the cathedral's legal office arrived in the scriptorium carrying a list of scribes who were expected to complete a set of land charters before the spring planting season. The clerk handed the list to the master of the scriptorium, who read the names silently before distributing assignments. You can almost imagine how ordinary this moment felt. The master's voice echoed softly across the narrow room as he read through the list. But when he reached the name Thomas, he paused. The list did not specify which Thomas. The clerk who delivered it shrugged, saying only that both men were known to write a steady hand and that the office assumed one would be available. This small oversight seemed harmless. Both men were present, and both had completed similar work before. The master of the scriptorium decided to divide the charters between them. But this decision set in motion a series of events that would confuse clerks, scribes, priests, and even the bishop himself for more than a decade. Thomas of Ely received the first half of the charters. He was a careful worker, though slower than some of the younger scribes. His handwriting tended to lean slightly to the right, and he often left narrow spaces between words. When he copied land agreements, he used formal language, rarely altering the phrasing even when a document contained inconsistencies. He believed that his job was not to correct, but to preserve. Thomas of Eltham received the second half. His script was straighter and bolder, with heavier strokes on the initial letters of each paragraph. He tended to adjust phrasing when he believed it would improve clarity. He did not see this as changing the meaning. Instead, he saw it as refining the document. He was confident in his judgment, and this confidence shaped the way he copied every text set before him. That winter, the 2 sets of charters were completed, reviewed, and filed by clerks who did not pay close attention to the subtle differences between the 2 men's writing styles. They simply saw the name Thomas on the assignment sheet and assumed that all the charters had been copied by the same person. Weeks passed, then months. The charters travelled from village to village, confirming rights to fields, market stalls, mills, and pastures that had been in use for generations. The people who relied on these charters never questioned the handwriting. Few of them could read, and those who could rarely understood the formal style used in legal documents. What mattered was the seal, and since each charter bore the cathedral's seal, no one doubted its authority. But during the next few years, more documents were needed. Land changed hands, disputes arose. New boundaries had to be drawn, and each time officials requested copies of past charters, they asked for them by the name of the scribe who had originally written them. In this case, the name written in the record book was simply Thomas. This was when the substitutions began. At first it happened quietly. A clerk looking for one Thomas found the other, and assigned him a task. A scribe answering a question believed he had worked on the document being discussed, even though the charter had been copied by his colleague. Because the documents themselves did not specify which Thomas had written them, neither clerk nor scribe realized the error. Each man believed he was simply continuing his own previous work. In a world where record-keeping shaped everything from taxes to marriage agreements, this confusion soon spread. As the years passed, entries in the archive began to link the 2 men's work into a single, invisible chain. Some charters copied by Thomas of Ely were believed to be the work of Thomas of Eltham. Others written by Eltham were attributed to Ely. The confusion then moved outward, affecting not only land records but also letters issued by the bishop, transcripts of sermons, and inventories of cathedral property. This confusion might have remained manageable if the 2 men had worked in precisely the same style, but their styles differed in quiet yet important ways. Those differences created inconsistencies that carried real consequences. A phrase slightly altered by Eltham would not match an earlier version preserved by Eller. A boundary description, written by Eller, would not reflect the adjustments made later by Eltham. When clerks and local officials compared documents, they began to notice small contradictions that they could not explain. For example, one charter recorded that a village field stretched to a certain oak tree near a stream, while another charter stated that the field ended at a small stone marker. The difference was not dramatic, but it was enough to cause a disagreement during a season when crop yields were low. Farmers who relied on precise land divisions grew uneasy. There were whispers that someone in the cathedral offices was interfering with property rights. The scribes themselves did not know how deeply the confusion had spread. They continued their work, often unaware that their writings were being mistaken for each other's. The master of the scriptorium did not notice, because the 2 men behaved responsibly and completed their assignments without complaint. And the clerks did not notice, because the documents bore no identifying marks except the name Thomas which both scribes shared. Over time, however, the consequences grew harder to ignore. The bishop received complaints from several villages that appeared to contradict each other. When he reviewed the documents involved, he found that the handwriting in one charter did not match the handwriting in another, even though the record book claimed they were written by the same man. He ordered the clerks to investigate. The clerks returned with the simplest answer. 2 men with the same name had both copied charters, and no one had distinguished their work. The bishop did not blame the scribes. Instead, he blamed the system. He instructed the officers to begin marking documents with full names, including place of origin. But this change came too late to resolve the problems already growing. Confusion had been layered upon confusion for years, and untangling it required more than new labels. The cathedral administration would spend another 5 years attempting to determine which scribe had written which document, and whether any of the inconsistencies carried legal implications. Yet there remained a deeper coincidence beneath all of this. During the entire period when their work was being confused, Thomas of Ely and Thomas of Eltham lived nearly identical lives. They fell ill during the same winter. They recovered during the same spring. They each requested leave to visit family during the same summer, though neither knew that the other had done so. One lost a brother. Months later, the other lost a cousin. Their lives moved in parallel without either man fully understanding how closely their paths aligned. When the bishop learned of this final detail from clerks who reviewed personal records, he remarked that he had never seen two people whose lives mirrored each other so quietly. He believed the coincidence was simply the product of chance. But some of the younger clerks wondered whether the confusion had been inevitable, shaped not by error but by the subtle ways in which ordinary lives sometimes align without meaning to. This first section of the story now settles here, at the point where a small administrative oversight began transforming into a deeper puzzle. You may now be left wondering how the cathedral officials attempted to resolve the confusion, and whether the two scribes themselves ever realized the role they had played in shaping the legal history of an entire region. You continue along the quiet stretches of medieval Europe, following the faint traces left behind by the two wandering scribes, whose lives seem to bend toward one another without ever fully touching. In the first section you witnessed the early years of Brother Aldrich of Mainz and the lay scholar Henry of Poitiers, two men separated by birth, language, temperament, and profession, and yet curiously symphonic in the rhythms of their choices. Now, as you enter the second section of their story, you move into a time when their paths began to narrow, when the open distances of their youths gave way to the tangled roots of adulthood, and when the ink on their pages started to speak to one another in ways neither man could have imagined. The middle years of a person's life were rarely recorded in detail during the medieval world. The quiet expansion of routine, the slow accumulation of responsibilities, and the persistent demands of survival left behind few elaborate descriptions. Yet these are often the years in which the subtle shaping of a life occurs, the period when coincidences grow roots deeper than one realizes. You may find yourself wondering why such small intersections matter, why small habits in distant regions deserve examination, and yet this is precisely where the most curious kind of history hides. Brother Aldrich, after completing his early training, found himself entrusted with a task that many monastic novices considered both a burden and an honor. He was sent to travel between affiliated houses of his order, carrying manuscripts for copying, correction, or safekeeping. Many monastic networks relied on itinerant scribes who could be trusted to transport intellectual treasure across contested landscapes and poorly maintained roads. Aldrich, steady in spirit and meticulous in practice, fit this role well. His cloister valued his patience more than his speed, and his attention more than his energy. For the next several years he moved between houses scattered across the regions that now form western Germany, eastern France, and the northern slopes of the Alps. Henry, during those same years, drifted further from the cathedral schools and deeper into the secular world of household archives, private libraries, and occasional commissions for merchants who wished to preserve genealogies or property histories. While Brother Aldrich copied sacred texts, Henry copied the details of ordinary lives, grain tallies, marriage contracts, letters of debt, and the humble petitions of travelers hoping to secure safe passage through lands governed by impatient lords. His work was not considered noble, but it was considered useful, and usefulness brought its own form of stability. Those who lived outside the monastic world depended on people like him far more than recorded chronicles would ever suggest. What neither man knew was that the routes they traveled, though anchored in different worlds, increasingly intersected in the same towns and on the same roads. In the medieval period, the great pilgrim paths that cut across Europe did not belong only to the devout. Merchants, messengers, couriers, scholars, and wanderers alike relied on the infrastructure that formed around them. Inns that welcomed pilgrims also welcomed scribes, and way stations that sold candle wax and wine to travelers also provided the quiet corners needed for repairing quills and smoothing stretched parchment. One such place was the town of Toul, positioned along a route often traveled by those moving between the Rhineland and the interior of France. Records from local toll ledgers during the early 1300s mention an unnamed scribe from Mainz and a Frenchman carrying writing instruments, both passing through within the same season. You can imagine Aldrich making a modest purchase of fresh ink, his robe still smelling faintly of the beeswax polish used in his home abbey, while somewhere nearby Henri was negotiating the price of parchment sheets for a merchant who needed a record kept for his expanding warehouse. They may have crossed paths entering or leaving the marketplace. They may have brushed shoulders inside the cramped little shop where writing supplies were sold alongside rosaries and travel icons. But medieval people did not announce themselves, and scribes were common enough that neither would have noticed anything unusual. What strengthens the sense of coincidence is not simply the shared roads but the shared subjects of their work. Brother Aldrich in these years was commissioned to revise and recopy a set of local saints' lives associated with several Rhineland communities. These texts were not grand works intended for distant audiences, but small local narratives intended to reinforce the identity of the region. At nearly the same time, Henry received multiple requests from families in the border towns to copy and preserve older documents relating to local devotional customs. His work was entirely practical, devoid of spiritual authority, but he sometimes copied prayers and brief accounts of local figures revered by the community. Centuries later, fragments of Aldrich's manuscripts and fragments of Henry's records were recovered from different archives and convent libraries. When compared, scholars noticed parallels in the names mentioned, the festivals described, and the traditions preserved. It appeared that Aldrich had been copying the refined monastic accounts of the same traditions that Henry preserved from the version maintained by ordinary townspeople. The two men, without knowing it, were simultaneously shaping two halves of a shared cultural memory. One half belonged to the cloistered world in which a saint's life was written in careful Latin and illuminated with calm devotion. The other half belonged to barns, workshops, and market squares where the same stories were told in vernacular speech, woven into wedding feasts and seasonal gatherings. It is in these overlapping layers of culture that the coincidences between their lives begin to take on a deeper quality. They were not simply two men traveling similar roads. They were two men preserving the same memory from opposite sides of society, one giving it form according to the order of the church, the other shaping it according to the needs of ordinary families. Without knowing it, they were building a mirror image of each other's work. During these years, both men also faced moments of quiet hardship that shaped their later decisions. Brother Aldrich, after a long journey through storm-soaked roads, fell ill at a small priory near the town of Metz. He spent several weeks recovering under the care of the infirmarian, whose records mention caring for a traveling scribe suffering from fever and exhaustion. Around that same time, Henri was struggling financially when a patron failed to pay him for a year of copying. In his frustration, he spent several months working for a cloth merchant, putting aside his writing tools, except in the evenings when he recorded his own observations in a rough personal ledger. What ties these experiences together is not the events themselves, but what they produced. Aldrich's illness forced him into stillness, and in that stillness he began drafting a personal commentary on the importance of local histories. He wrote about the value of preserving the stories of small towns and quiet communities, arguing that the everyday practices of believers were as important as the great theological declarations made in distant councils. At almost the same time, Henry's financial hardship encouraged him to observe the daily rhythms of the workshops, storehouses, and docks where goods were measured and exchanged. His personal notes, though never intended for public reading, describe the habits of ordinary people in ways few medieval documents capture. Only fragments of these writings survive, but scholars have long noted the peculiar way they seem to echo one another. Aldrich reflected on the sanctity of daily life through a monastic lens, while Henry described the significance of similar habits from a secular perspective. Their tones differed, but their subjects matched. It is as though both men, living separate lives shaped by separate circumstances, were nudged toward the same understanding at the same moment. Their geographic proximity during these years only deepens the sense of convergence. Travel logs from a monastery in Lorraine suggest that Aldrich stayed there for several weeks on clerical assignment. Tax records from the same region note a payment made on behalf of a French scribe named Henri for temporary lodging among the town's artisans. Once again they appear in the same place within the same season, although documentation does not suggest they interacted. But perhaps the most curious link between them during this period involves a manuscript that neither man intended to impact the other. Brother Aldrich copied a set of psalms for a small chapel near the Burgundian frontier. The manuscript included a simple marginal note written by Aldrich himself, referring to the need for scribes to remain attentive to the rhythms of common life, for within those rhythms the divine order could be glimpsed. Some years later, that same chapel hired Henri to create a supplementary record of its property holdings. It is entirely plausible that Henri handled the manuscript Aldrich created, though no surviving evidence can prove it. Those who have studied the worn edges of the pages note that at least one reader in the years following Aldrich's work traced a fingertip along the margin where the note is written. Whether that reader was Henri is unknown, yet the possibility remains one of the quiet wonders of this story, that Henri may have unknowingly touched the words of the man whose life paralleled his own so closely. If such small interactions seem insignificant, you may consider how few medieval lives were documented in detail. Most people left behind no written trace at all. That Aldrich and Henri, both wrote extensively, both traveled widely, and both preserved the local identities of their regions, makes their paired journey remarkable enough. That their routes intersected repeatedly without acknowledgement adds another layer, and that their ideas began to reflect one another during the same period invites the question of how much influence can occur, even without direct contact, carried by the shared experiences of roads walked and communities observed. As the middle years of their lives unfolded, the quiet shaping that began in their youths transformed into something firmer. Both men grew more certain of their purpose. Aldrich deepened his belief that writing could preserve the fragile stories of small communities. Hendry began to appreciate the value of documenting the lives of ordinary families, not for posterity, but for stability, in a world often shaken by political shifts. Their beliefs, though formed separately, continued to bend toward the same conclusion. Yet the coincidences of their journeys were far from complete. The greatest and most revealing intersections were still ahead of them, emerging in a period of turmoil that would disrupt the assumptions both men held about their work. As they entered these later years, their paths would not merely brush against one another, but begin to shape events that would ripple long after their lifetimes. You return to the quiet landscape shaped by the two wandering scribes, Brother Aldrich of Mainz and the lay scholar, Henry of Poitiers. By now you have seen how their early choices bent slowly toward one another, how their middle years brought them into the same towns, under the same roofs, and into contact with the same stories. Yet, despite this, there was never a moment when history recorded an actual meeting. That absence becomes the starting point of this final section, where you discover how the end of their lives brought the greatest coincidence of all, one that shaped the written memory of the regions they both served. You begin in the troubled decades that closed their journeys. This was a period marked by hunger in some regions, conflict in others, and a slow yet heavy shift in the structure of European life. The weather darkened for many years in the early centuries of the medieval world, harvests shrank, and families who once relied on predictable cycles now found themselves in fragile conditions. In response, communities turned more urgently toward the preservation of their own identities. They feared that if their customs, boundaries, and stories were not recorded, they might disappear without trace. It was in this atmosphere that scribes became more valuable than ever. Brother Aldrich, after decades of work, was now seen as a veteran scribe, whose steady hand and calm presence brought reassurance to the abbeys that relied on him. His writing had grown slower but more deliberate, each stroke a careful act of devotion. He no longer traveled as often, but when he did, his journeys took him farther south than before, reaching the edges of Burgundy and the foothills of the Jura Mountains. He was trusted with the task of collecting small manuscripts, carried from parish to parish, preserving the fragile memory of local saints and seasonal customs that risked being lost. Henry, in those same years, faced a world that demanded more from those who worked outside the monastic walls. Records grew more complex, households expanded their inventories, market towns needed more accurate tallies, and even small villages hired scribes to preserve agreements between families. Henry's work became steadier, though rarely comfortable, and his modest income depended on the reliability of those who hired him. Yet he continued to write for himself as well, keeping personal observations in the margins of whatever scrap parchment he could spare. These small notes were never intended to survive, yet some of them did, and they offer a rare glimpse into the everyday thoughts of a medieval lay scribe. The quiet fascination of their parallel lives peaks during these later years. Both men were eventually drawn toward the same region, a place lying between the Rhine basin and the Burgundian frontier. This was not the result of any shared purpose. It was simply where the demands of their work carried them. But unlike earlier periods, when they might have passed through the same town within the same season, the records from these years suggest a more striking proximity. A monastic travel ledger from the outskirts of Besançon includes an entry describing a visiting scribe from Mainz who spent a short stay copying a manuscript for the local brothers. Only a few weeks later, a local property record from the same settlement mentions a French scribe hired to prepare a household inventory. Scholars have long debated whether this was mere coincidence or evidence that the two scribes were in the same small community at the same time. You might imagine Aldrich sitting in the dimly lit scriptorium, adjusting the wick of a tallow lamp to keep the light steady as he works through worn parchment. A floor beneath him, you might picture Henri, sitting at a rough wooden table in a storeroom filled with sacks of grain, tallying the goods of a local merchant. The two men were likely only a few steps apart. The same bells would have marked their hours. The same winter winds would have pressed against the shutters, and the same smells of bread ovens, wool shops, and smoke from the hearth would have filled the air. Yet once again, history preserves no trace of a meeting. This absence is part of what makes their story compelling. Medieval records rarely provide complete pictures. They give glimpses, hints, suggestions. The coincidences between Aldrich and Henry form a pattern that is visible only because their work left behind more traces than most. Still, it is the final act of their parallel lives that shaped the greatest coincidence of all. During the last years of his life, Brother Aldrich was entrusted with organizing a collection of manuscripts that had been gathered from local parishes, vulnerable to conflict. The abbey hoped to create a unified volume preserving the traditions of the surrounding countryside. It was a monumental effort, far beyond the ability of one man, yet Aldrich accepted the task with the quiet patience that defined his life. He worked tirelessly, sorting through damaged parchment, identifying repeated passages, and arranging the texts into a coherent form. His method was simple but effective. He preserved the words exactly as they appeared in each parish document, and wrote brief notes in the margins explaining their origin. During the same span of years, Henry received a commission from a group of merchants who wanted a record of their family's customs and inherited obligations. It was part genealogy, part inventory, and part devotional record. This work required him to travel through many of the same towns that had supplied the manuscripts Aldrich was compiling. Henry did not know that the stories he copied from these households mirrored the content of the parish manuscripts that Aldrich handled 2 or 3 years earlier, nor could he have imagined that the phrases spoken casually during kitchen gatherings or winter feasts would eventually stand beside the carefully refined monastic versions preserved by Aldrich. What binds their final years together is something that neither man lived to see: the merging of their texts. After Aldrich's passing, his manuscript collection remained in the abbey where he last worked. After Henry's death, his merchant record passed through several hands and eventually entered the possession of the same abbey through a donation made by one of the families he served. When the monks combined the two collections into a unified local chronicle, they unknowingly placed the work of the two scribes side by side. This unified chronicle still survives today, though in incomplete form. Its margins show Aldrich's steady notes. Its interior sections include the sometimes uneven but heartfelt writing that scholars attribute to Henry. The blending of these two voices created one of the most detailed local histories of the region, one that preserves both the official monastic memory and the lived memory of ordinary people. The final story of their parallel lives, therefore, exists not in whether they met, but in the way their work became inseparable. You may find yourself wondering whether this merging of texts was inevitable. Was it simply the result of the limited number of scribes available in a region where literacy was rare, or did something deeper connect their lives? Something rooted in the quiet but powerful desire to preserve the fragile details of community identity. Their story invites reflection on the nature of influence, on how two people who never met can still shape a shared narrative, and on how coincidence can become part of the foundations of history. As you leave their story behind, you may ask yourself what other parallel lives unfolded across the medieval world, unseen and unrecorded, shaping the written memory that guided generations. Did other pairs of scribes drift along the same roads, carrying similar burdens, guided by circumstances that tied their lives together without their knowledge? And how many of the documents we rely on today reflect the hidden collaboration of strangers who never exchanged a single word? Their story concludes with that quiet, persistent question. You now step into another corner of medieval history, a place defined not by men or scribes, but by the resonance of a single object whose absence echoed more widely than anyone at the time could have imagined. This story begins in the city of Durham, nestled along the River Wear in northern England during the early 14th century. The tale revolves around a bell that disappeared under circumstances so mundane yet so improbable that it confounded clergy, townspeople, and even the bishop himself for decades. The narrative unfolds slowly, as all ordinary histories do, because the events depend on routine schedules, human error, and the subtle rhythms of life that seem insignificant at first glance, but ripple outward in unforeseen ways. Durham Cathedral in the early 1300s was already a centre of religious and administrative authority. Its stone walls rose from the high bank above the river, casting shadows over the surrounding town. Inside, monks and clerics carried out their daily duties with exacting discipline. Bells rang to mark canonical hours, summoning the faithful to prayer, signalling the approach of work in nearby workshops, and announcing events within the city. These bells were not merely tools of sound, they were instruments that regulated the lives of thousands, threading together the spiritual, social, and practical existence of the town. Among these bells was one particularly large and carefully cast in the foundry of York, installed in the cathedral's central tower. Its deep, sonorous tone was so clear that it could be heard across the city and the surrounding villages. The bell was not just a marker of time, it was a symbol of authority and continuity. Clerics relied on it for scheduling. Town officials timed markets according to its peals, and even traveling merchants used its chimes to gauge distance and proximity as they moved through the region. In short, the bell was ordinary in function but extraordinary in importance, a practical tool woven into the fabric of daily life. The story of its disappearance begins on a winter morning, when the cathedral's bell ringer, a man named Oswin, ascended the tower to inspect the ringing mechanism. Oswin had been entrusted with this duty for several years. Each day he checked the ropes, pulleys and clappers, ensuring that the bell functioned properly. On this particular morning, he discovered that one of the pulleys had shifted slightly, and a rope appeared frayed. Concerned, he began the process of tightening the ropes and adjusting the alignment of the clapper. To his knowledge, no one else had accessed the tower in weeks. Yet when the bell was rung for the noon prayer, its tone was strangely muted. Oswin inspected the bell more closely and realized that its placement had changed, not by much, but enough to affect its resonance. Further examination revealed a more troubling fact. A small bronze plate near the bell's base, inscribed with the foundry mark, had been removed. This was the first sign of a mystery that would deepen in complexity as the weeks went on. The cathedral chapter convened to discuss the matter. Clerics, lay stewards, and the bishop himself examined the records and interviewed those who had access to the tower. Nothing unusual had been reported. There were no signs of forced entry, no theft in the town that coincided with the bell's adjustment, and no recorded disputes among the bell ringers. Yet the bell continued to ring differently, its tone altered in subtle but perceptible ways. As winter passed into spring, the absence of the plate became more noticeable. Craftsmen who had been called to inspect the bell confirmed that the missing piece affected not only the bell's resonance, but also the stability of the clapper. Repairs were necessary to prevent further damage. This was not urgent in the sense of immediate danger, but it required attention lest the bell suffer long-term wear. Then came the coincidence that confounded everyone. Several months later, a bell in the nearby town of Chesterley Street began to exhibit the same tonal irregularities as Durham's bell. At first, locals assumed it was a simple mechanical fault, but when craftsmen examined both bells, they realized that the missing plate from Durham matched perfectly with a similar cavity on the Chester bell. The implication was clear. Somehow the bronze plate that had been removed from Durham's bell had traveled more than 20 miles north and was installed, or had accidentally become lodged in another bell. This revelation astonished the chapter. How could a single piece of bronze have moved between two bells without human intention or recorded transport? Clerics speculated about natural causes, perhaps flooding along the River Ware had carried the plate downstream. Yet the logistics of such a heavy bronze piece moving intact and being positioned in another bell seemed improbable. No records indicated any shipment or trade between the two towns that might have included the plate. Further complicating the matter, the timing was curious. Durham's plate went missing in midwinter, when rivers froze and travel was difficult. Chester's bell exhibited tonal changes by early spring, suggesting that the plate had arrived during a period when movement was nearly impossible. Clerics, craftsmen, and even town officials were left with an unanswerable question. Had some unseen force moved the metal, or had someone orchestrated a deliberate, unrecorded relocation? Amid this mystery, ordinary lives carried on. The bell ringers continued their routines, unaware of the larger implications. Merchants measured their goods and timed their deliveries by the altered tones. Villagers relied on the chimes for hours of labor and prayer. In many ways, life persisted as normal, yet the coincidence lingered. One small, unremarkable piece of bronze had managed to traverse towns, alter soundscapes, and quietly bind together two communities' daily rhythms in a way that would puzzle generations. The story becomes even more curious when you consider the records kept by the cathedral chapter. In attempting to trace the origin of the missing plate, clerics discovered that a bellcaster from York had documented a surplus of bronze, noting small, unassigned pieces left after casting multiple bells. Some of these pieces had been distributed to smaller foundries for reuse. No document connected the Durham plate specifically to Chester, yet historians later hypothesized that some bureaucratic oversight might have inadvertently allowed the same piece of bronze to enter two separate casting or repair projects. From a practical standpoint, the mystery could have a mundane explanation: error, oversight, or coincidence in supply chains. Yet what renders the story memorable is the way this unassuming misplacement affected ordinary life. For decades, bell tones were subtly altered in both towns. Farmers, merchants, and clerics noticed discrepancies in timing and resonance. Documents from the period indicate disputes about when prayers began, when markets opened, and when church services were supposed to start. No one could explain the root cause. Only centuries later would historians reconstruct the probable sequence of events, revealing the quiet, improbable link between two towns through a single bronze plate. By the time the bell was properly repaired and its original tone restored, the coincidence had entered local lore. Chroniclers mentioned the wandering piece of bronze with quiet amusement, noting that it had travelled as if by its own will. There were no dramatic confrontations, no thefts, no elaborate chase, only the slow accumulation of small decisions, routine inspections, and minor oversights that allowed the object to move undetected. You may now consider the broader significance of this story. It is not remarkable because someone intended it, or because the object had magical properties. It is remarkable because ordinary lives, those of clerics, craftsmen, merchants, and villagers, intersected unknowingly, producing a situation that no single individual could have planned. The coincidence was subtle, practical, and thoroughly mundane. Yet its effect persisted for decades, illustrating how small misalignments in human action could ripple outward, shaping the soundscape and the routines of an entire community. As you leave this first section, the question lingers: how often did similar coincidences occur in medieval life, unnoticed, recorded only in the minor quirks of daily experience? How many ordinary objects carried extraordinary influence simply because of the paths they followed and the decisions of those who handled them? In pondering this, you glimpse the quiet, interconnected web of medieval society, where even the smallest incident could produce outcomes far beyond its apparent significance. You return now to the story of the bell whose journey seemed to defy reason, moving quietly from Durham toward Chester-le-Street, leaving behind a trail of minor disruptions, altered routines, and perplexed clerics. In the first section you observed how a small bronze plate, removed or displaced from Durham's great cathedral bell, travelled in a manner that historians can only speculate about. In this section, the narrative deepens. You follow the human responses to this curious event, and see how coincidences multiplied in ways no one at the time could have anticipated. After the initial discovery of the missing plate, the cathedral chapter convened multiple meetings to determine both the immediate cause and the long-term implications. These meetings were, by all contemporary accounts, painstakingly dull. Clerics argued over the phrasing of records, the proper method for inspecting bells, and whether certain rituals should be performed to cleanse the sound of the bell, now that it rang irregularly. Yet in these dull discussions, minor errors compounded. Each cleric recorded slightly different accounts, some suggesting theft, others suggesting mechanical failure, and still others hinting at divine will. One subtle but crucial decision occurred when the chapter assigned a young novice, Brother Edmund, to document the bell's condition in a new ledger. Edmund, meticulous but inexperienced, described the missing plate in ambiguous terms. His description mentioned the plate's approximate size, its bronze composition, and its location relative to the bell's base, but not the unique markings of the foundry. These minor omissions would later create confusion for anyone attempting to trace the object, ensuring that future readers of the records would see only partial information. Meanwhile, the town of Durham continued to rely on the bell for its daily routines. Farmers timed the beginning of harvest work by its chimes. Merchants set their opening hours according to its peal. Even children attending the cathedral school learned to mark lessons and meals by the changing sounds of the bell. Yet all of this routine now incorporated a subtle irregularity, a quiet discrepancy that no one consciously noticed. The coincidence deepened when a second bell ringer, Oswin's apprentice, named Walter, travelled with the cathedral to oversee temporary repairs in nearby chapels. Walter carried with him measurements, rope samples, and fragments of minor repairs intended for smaller bells. One day he visited a chapel in a village midway between Durham and Chester-le-Street. Here, a bell of similar size had been noted as producing an irregular tone. Walter, relying on the incomplete records from Durham, assumed that a local craftsman had been improvising repairs. He left behind a fragment of bronze, small, curved, and remarkably similar in size to the missing Durham plate. This act, entirely routine from Walter's perspective, created a domino effect. Within a few months, the same fragment of bronze found its way into the casting or adjustment of Chester-le-Street's main bell. The townspeople did not note the arrival of the new plate, Craftsmen integrated it as they would any ordinary piece of bronze, adjusting the clapper and testing the tone. The result was that Chester's bell now rang with an unusual timbre, eerily similar to the altered tone of Durham's bell. The coincidence, invisible to those involved, connected two towns in sound, rhythm, and confusion. Even clerical and municipal records from the period hint at an unusual layering of administrative coincidences. In Durham, records show repeated requests for bell inspections, noting tonal inconsistencies but lacking technical expertise to resolve the issue. In Chester, the city council documented minor complaints about the bell's sound and its impact on market hours. Neither town connected the two events, yet the timing aligned almost perfectly. By the time both towns realized that something unusual was occurring, the coincidence had become deeply embedded in local life. Another remarkable factor was human psychology. People noticed anomalies in sound, yet the variations were subtle enough to be rationalized as seasonal changes, weather effects, or minor mechanical wear. Clerics blamed fatigue or misalignment, merchants blamed drafts or the movement of goods, children blamed their own inattention. No one considered that a single bronze plate might have migrated, become integrated into a new bell, and simultaneously altered both towns' routines. During this period, the cathedral chapter attempted corrective action. Craftsmen were called to inspect Durham's bell, measurements were taken, and temporary adjustments were made. Yet even as the bell returned to a semblance of its former tone, Chester's bell continued to echo with the same peculiarities. The overlapping sound patterns created a strange auditory coincidence. Those traveling between the two towns could, in theory, hear similar anomalies in different locations, unaware of the underlying cause. What makes this period particularly fascinating is how ordinary life intersected with the improbable. The missing plate, the clerical decisions, and the apprentice's actions created an unrecorded chain of events whose consequences were felt in both civic and spiritual domains. Markets opened slightly late, services began slightly early, farmers measured their fields according to familiar markers, yet sometimes found their tools mismatched to the bell's signal. Each small disruption had little immediate impact, yet collectively it produced a subtle reshaping of daily routines across multiple towns. One chronicler, writing decades later, described the wandering bronze in poetic, almost humorous terms. He noted that the bell seemed to have grown legs and wandered from one tower to another, subtly instructing townsfolk in patience, observation, and adaptation. While such embellishments reflect the medieval taste for moralizing anecdotes, they also hint at the awareness, however unconscious, of the coincidence itself. People noticed patterns and disruptions, even if they did not understand their origin. Meanwhile, the craftsmen involved continued their ordinary work, unaware that they had participated in a remarkable convergence. Metal workers, bell founders, and carpenters carried out their tasks according to routine procedures. Apprentices followed instructions, supervisors inspected results, and payments were recorded. These mundane actions ensured that the coincidence persisted rather than resolving naturally. Without deliberate intent, the missing plate's journey remained undetected. It is worth noting how small errors and oversights multiplied the effect. Brother Edmund's incomplete record, Walter's routine handling of bronze fragments, the craftsman's unquestioning use of materials, and the townspeople's rationalizations all contributed to the continued uncertainty. Each individual acted within ordinary patterns of behavior, yet together their actions created an extraordinary historical phenomenon. This illustrates a subtle truth about medieval life: the daily rhythms, clerical routines, and minor decisions that seem insignificant, over time produce outcomes that are entirely unpredictable. By the end of this period, both Durham and Chester had internalized the coincidence as part of local routine. Clerics no longer attempted to pinpoint the cause of the tonal discrepancies. Merchants adapted to slight shifts in market hours. Children and apprentices adjusted to the altered signals without complaint. The extraordinary event had become ordinary, its unusual cause hidden beneath layers of habit, assumption, and human error. As the section closes, you may reflect on the significance of this story. It is remarkable not because of theft, crime, or dramatic confrontation. It is remarkable because of the quiet, cumulative coincidences that shaped multiple communities over decades. One small bronze plate moved undetected, altered soundscapes, and intertwined daily routines in ways that no contemporary observer could fully understand. The story demonstrates how ordinary people, acting in ordinary ways, can inadvertently create patterns that reverberate far beyond immediate perception. You are left with a lingering question: How many other mundane objects in the medieval world carried hidden influence, shaping lives, routines, and social structures in ways that were never recorded? And how often do small coincidences, unnoticed at the time, create enduring patterns that historians can only reconstruct centuries later? You return now to the final chapter of The Lost Bell of Durham, where the consequences of a single small bronze plate culminate in a resolution that is both extraordinary and quiet, perfectly in line with the subtle rhythms of medieval life. By now you have traced the initial disappearance, followed the coinciding events in Durham and Chester-le Street, and observed the human responses that allowed the plate's improbable journey to continue. In this last section the story moves toward closure, but not in a dramatic or sensational way. Instead, it illustrates how ordinary lives, routine decisions, and unnoticed coincidences can produce outcomes that ripple through communities for decades. Several years after the initial incident, Durham Cathedral commissioned a full restoration of its bell tower. The work was intended not only to repair the aging structure, but also to inspect each bell carefully. Craftsmen were brought from York, Lincoln, and local workshops. Among them was master bell founder Robert, whose reputation for precision and attention to detail was unmatched in northern England. Robert approached the task systematically, examining each bell, its clapper, and all associated mechanisms. He meticulously recorded each anomaly in a ledger that still survives in fragmentary form. It was during this thorough inspection that the missing bronze plate was finally accounted for. Curiously, it was not located in Chester-le Street, but had in fact been returned to Durham. Scholars examining later records suggest that a series of subtle administrative coincidences caused its journey back. A traveling apprentice unknowingly carried it as part of a batch of spare metal to Durham, where it was stored in a workshop awaiting future repairs. No one at the time realized that the plate had been absent for years, subtly altering the sound of two separate bells along the way. The discovery itself was uneventful. Craftsmen identified the plate, noted its correct placement on Durham's largest bell, and reattached it. The bell was rung for the first time after restoration, and the deep, sonorous tone returned to what people remembered from decades prior. Townspeople were surprised at how distinctly the bell sounded, but no one could explain why its tone had seemed altered for so long. Only the cathedral records preserved the full story, listing in minute detail the events that, at the time, seemed minor or irrelevant. What makes the conclusion of this story so remarkable is not the repair itself, but the subtle, unforeseen consequences that followed. By the time the bell was restored, the coincidence had already influenced multiple aspects of life in both Durham and Chester-le Street. Farmers, merchants, and clergy had adapted their routines around the altered sound, incorporating slight adjustments in market times, prayer schedules, and daily labor. The town's rhythms had, over decades, quietly synchronized in a way that no one planned, and the bell's final repair brought a subtle dissonance between expectation and experience. People expected the bell to be exactly as it had once been, yet their adapted routines meant that its restored sound required a minor adjustment in perception. The story also highlights the hidden networks of human activity that facilitated such coincidences. Apprentices, clerks, craftsmen, and bell ringers, all individuals acting within ordinary patterns of work, played roles that were never recorded in a meaningful narrative. Each small decision, each oversight, each routine action created a chain of events whose cumulative effect was far greater than the sum of its parts. In this way, The Lost Bell illustrates the quiet power of everyday life. How small actions, unnoticed at the moment, can shape community rhythms, preserve history, and create coincidences that endure long after those involved have passed away. Historians who have reconstructed the events often marvel at the improbability of the sequence. A single plate, weighing only a few pounds, traveled unnoticed, altered the auditory landscape of two towns, and became embedded in both civic and religious routines. Its journey depended entirely on routine tasks: a ledger recorded incorrectly, an apprentice transporting bronze fragments, craftsmen reusing materials without question. None of these actions were remarkable on their own, but collectively they produced a historical coincidence that could not have been orchestrated by any single person. The story also invites reflection on the nature of coincidence itself. In the medieval world, when communication was slow and record-keeping imperfect, many such coincidences occurred unnoticed. Objects, people, and information moved in ways that were largely invisible to contemporaries. It is only through careful reconstruction, often centuries later, that historians can see the patterns that emerge. The Lost Bell of Durham is one of the clearest examples, because it left both tangible and social traces: an altered sound, changed routines, and a written record that preserves the memory of an improbable sequence of events. Another layer of significance lies in the human response to the coincidence. Clerics, craftsmen, and townspeople adapted quietly, incorporating minor disruptions into daily life without complaint. The medieval world was accustomed to uncertainty. Weather, harvests, disease, and political instability demanded flexibility. The altered sound of a bell, while noticeable, was simply another factor in the complex web of ordinary existence. And yet, in retrospect, it is precisely this quiet adaptation that magnifies the historical importance of the event. By accommodating small anomalies, people unwittingly allowed coincidences to produce lasting effects. Interestingly, the story has a subtle echo in the way future bell casting and maintenance were conducted. Cathedral chapters across northern England began documenting spare bronze fragments more carefully, recording their origin, destination, and intended use. Bell founders, apprentices, and clerical stewards paid more attention to placement, resonance, and alignment. In other words, the coincidence of a wandering plate indirectly shaped procedural improvements, reinforcing a culture of precision that would persist in subsequent generations. As the tale concludes, you may consider its quiet lessons. It is not remarkable for drama or deliberate action. It is remarkable for the ordinary intersecting with the improbable, the everyday tasks of human life producing consequences that ripple across time and space. A single object, moved unnoticed, altered community rhythms, and centuries later, left a story that continues to captivate historians. Finally, the story invites reflection on the nature of memory, history, and cause. How many other objects, unnoticed at the time, quietly shaped the patterns of human activity? How many coincidences, small and mundane, went unrecorded because they occurred outside the view of chroniclers? In considering the Lost Bell of Durham, you glimpse the subtle and pervasive influence of ordinary life, where coincidence and routine intertwine to create outcomes far beyond immediate perception. The lost bell now hangs in Durham, fully restored, ringing with the sound it had for centuries, yet in its tones, one can imagine the quiet journey of a small bronze plate, traveling unnoticed, shaping lives in ways no contemporary could have imagined. It remains a symbol of the hidden complexity of medieval life, a reminder that even the most mundane objects can carry extraordinary influence. You now move to the quiet marshlands of eastern England, where the town of Wisbech sits along the edge of the River Nene. Unlike the dramatic accounts of battles and famous sieges, this story is remarkable precisely because it is unremarkable in its appearance. A siege that left few traces, involved no legendary generals, and altered the lives of ordinary people more than it influenced kingdoms. Yet within this mundane struggle lies a fascinating tale of endurance, human adaptation, and subtle coincidences that shaped the region for decades. The year is 1232. During the reign of King Henry III, Wisbech Castle, a modest fortification originally built during the Norman period, had been strengthened with stone and timber over the previous century. It was primarily a seat of local administration and a stronghold to enforce royal authority over the fens, a marshy region where travel was difficult and small-scale rebellion a recurring problem. Unlike the large castles of the Midlands or the North, Wisbech was rarely the site of major battles, yet its strategic position along river routes and marshlands made it a focus of local disputes and political maneuvering. The siege began not with a dramatic clash of armies, but with a slow tightening of control. A local baron, seeking to assert authority over the marshland villages, sent a contingent of armed men to surround the castle, limiting access to supplies and trade. Records do not indicate the size of the force, only that it was sufficient to pressure the castle without risking a pitched battle. For the inhabitants, this siege was initially a quiet nuisance. Gates remained locked, river access was monitored, and merchants could no longer travel freely. To the outside world, the castle appeared calm, yet inside, the daily rhythm of life was slowly disrupted. You can picture the castle's small garrison, numbering perhaps a few dozen men-at-arms, and supported by a handful of clerics and servants, moving about the narrow stone corridors, fetching water from wells, and managing stores of grain and salted meat. The baron's men stationed themselves along key river crossings, preventing merchants from bringing in fresh supplies. Every day became a careful exercise in rationing. Bread was sliced thinner, firewood burned sparingly, and livestock consumption carefully calculated. Even the routines of prayer, study, and clerical work were adjusted to accommodate the reduced resources. Coincidence played a subtle but critical role. Local villagers, attempting to navigate the marshes, discovered hidden routes that bypassed the main patrols. They quietly delivered messages and small provisions, unaware that their minor acts of ingenuity were essential to sustaining the castle's occupants. These deliveries were never recorded formally, yet without them, the garrison might have suffered far more quickly. The coincidence lies in the fact that these villagers, acting for their own survival or for minor favors, intersected with the broader currents of siege logistics in a way that no one at the time recognized as historically significant. Inside the castle, the daily monotony fostered subtle human dramas. Soldiers debated the best methods of conserving food, clerics recorded the slow passage of time, and servants adapted to the irregular supply of water and firewood. These details, often overlooked by chroniclers, reveal the resilience and ingenuity of ordinary people. The castle became a microcosm of the broader medieval experience. Life continued under constraint, and small adjustments made the difference between endurance and collapse. One particularly intriguing coincidence involved a shipment of barley intended for a distant monastery. The convoy, delayed by marsh flooding and navigational errors, accidentally delivered its cargo to Wisbech Castle. The timing was fortuitous. The garrison had nearly exhausted its grain stores, and this unplanned delivery allowed them to continue rationing without resorting to extreme measures. Records of this shipment survive only in passing notes, yet the minor misrouting of a routine supply demonstrates how seemingly trivial events could dramatically alter outcomes. The siege dragged on quietly for months. Outside, the Baron's men grew frustrated, their patrols complicated by tides, weather, and marsh conditions. Inside, the garrison relied increasingly on small improvisations, collecting rainwater in barrels, mending old tools instead of waiting for new ones, and stretching supplies in ways that required careful calculation. Every minor success was the result of human ingenuity intersecting with circumstance, a pattern of coincidences that shaped the endurance of the castle. By the end of the first winter, the siege had become a test of patience rather than military might. The Baron lacked sufficient resources to sustain a long-term blockade, while the garrison had developed routines that maximized efficiency and minimized waste. The coincidence of weather patterns, local geography, and the inadvertent delivery of provisions contributed to an outcome that favored the castle's occupants without any strategic brilliance or decisive action. As you leave this first section, you are invited to reflect on how ordinary individuals, through small, unnoticed acts, can shape historical events. The siege of Wisbech Castle was not recorded in epic chronicles or heroic ballads, yet it illustrates a profound truth. History is often the accumulation of mundane choices, chance encounters, and quiet resilience. The coincidence of human action, timing, and environment can be just as decisive as any battle or treaty. You return now to the marshlands surrounding Wisbech, where the castle continues its quiet struggle against the slow pressure of the Baron's forces. In the first section, you witnessed how the garrison endured the early months of the siege, relying on careful rationing, ingenuity, and the subtle coincidences of supply misroutes and hidden paths through the marshes. In this second section, the story deepens, focusing on the prolonged endurance of the castle, the incremental human adaptations that allowed survival, and the small but consequential events that shaped life both inside and outside the walls. As the siege entered its second winter, conditions became harsher. Freezing nights and heavy rainfall turned the surrounding marshes into treacherous quagmires. The Baron's men, positioned along the main access routes, found travel increasingly difficult. Patrols were slowed, communication with other settlements became unreliable, and morale began to waver. They had hoped a few months of pressure would force the castle to surrender, but instead, the very landscape conspired to preserve its inhabitants. Inside Wisbech Castle, the garrison's routines became more precise and deliberate. Soldiers monitored their rations down to the smallest measure, calculating daily allocations of grain, meat, and water. Clerics continued their prayers at canonical hours, adjusting their schedules to conserve heat in poorly insulated chambers. Servants improvised cooking techniques, boiling water only when fuel allowed, stretching salt and herbs to maintain the palatability of meager meals. Life became a careful rhythm of observation, adaptation, and endurance. Coincidence continued to play a critical role. One day, a small group of local fishermen, navigating the frozen marshes, discovered an abandoned boat lodged along a narrow channel. Unbeknownst to the garrison, the vessel contained barrels of salted fish that had been intended for a distant village, but had been delayed by weather and ice. This unexpected provision arrived at precisely the moment when protein supplies were lowest. Such minor interventions, entirely accidental from the perspective of the fishermen, had outsized consequences, allowing the castle's inhabitants to maintain strength and morale. The human dynamics inside the castle also grew more intricate. Soldiers shared tasks with clerics and servants, and informal hierarchies developed around expertise rather than rank. The cook, for example, gained authority over how grain was rationed, while a young page assumed responsibility for managing firewood and heating arrangements. These roles, though small and unofficial, became critical to the survival of the garrison. They illustrate how, under sustained stress, ordinary individuals can assert influence far beyond their formal status. Beyond the castle walls, the Baron faced unexpected difficulties. The marshes, while a natural defense for the garrison, also hindered his own troops. Some men fell ill from exposure to damp conditions, while others were delayed by sudden floods that made supply lines nearly impassable. By chance, a single storm redirected part of his contingent to an unintended location, preventing them from cutting off a minor channel that the castle's inhabitants had been using for secret provisions. This event, minor in isolation, proved decisive in prolonging the siege. Another coincidence involved a local miller, whose water wheel had been damaged in the previous autumn. Attempting repairs, he diverted a portion of the river's flow into a hidden channel. The garrison discovered this diversion while scouting water sources, using it to supplement their limited supply. Neither the miller nor the castle's occupants understood the significance of the action beyond immediate utility, yet it exemplified how the intersection of independent actions and circumstances could produce remarkable outcomes. Over time, the castle developed a form of self-sufficiency rarely noted in chronicles. Rainwater collection became routine, small gardens inside the walls were expanded, and livestock was carefully managed to maximize both food and manure for the gardens. The garrison's survival depended not on heroism or battle skill, but on the accumulation of countless minor decisions, many influenced by coincidences, environmental conditions, and the ingenuity of ordinary people. One particularly curious episode involved the accidental discovery of an underground chamber beneath one of the castle's walls. The chamber had been filled with old supplies left over from previous renovations, including salted meat, grains, and spare tools. Its discovery was purely coincidental. A minor shift in the foundation caused a loose flagstone to tilt, revealing the hidden cache. This unexpected windfall allowed the garrison to endure a particularly harsh month of food scarcity, further reinforcing the role of chance and the unseen hand of circumstance in medieval life. Meanwhile, tensions within the Baron's forces began to emerge. Men were delayed by marsh conditions, quarrels over supplies arose, and minor skirmishes with villagers drained attention and energy. These disruptions were never recorded in official chronicles, yet they illustrate how small ordinary challenges can accumulate, affecting larger historical outcomes. The garrison, in contrast, grew more adept at responding to the environment, learning to adapt routines to changing circumstances, and finding subtle ways to exploit minor oversights in the besiegers' strategy. Throughout the siege, records show that the townspeople continued their lives as best they could. Markets opened irregularly, fairs were postponed, and trade fluctuated according to the ebb and flow of the castle's fortunes. Clerical notes and household accounts indicate that families adjusted work schedules, timing labor to avoid interference with patrols, or to take advantage of brief periods when provisions could be delivered. These adaptations, unnoticed by historians for centuries, highlight how the mundane choices of ordinary people intersected with the larger events of the siege. The siege eventually dragged on into the spring, approaching its third year. At this point, the Baron's forces began to lose cohesion. Weather, illness, and logistical strain, combined with the garrison's growing expertise, to reduce the effectiveness of the blockade. What had begun as a straightforward attempt to assert control evolved into a slow, stalemated contest, shaped largely by environment, routine, and chance events. By the end of this section, the pattern is clear. The siege of Wisbeck Castle was not remarkable for its violence or dramatic confrontation, but for the accumulation of subtle coincidences, ordinary actions, and environmental factors that allowed survival against the odds. The garrison endured because of careful rationing, adaptive routines, fortuitous discoveries, and the intersecting decisions of countless individuals, each acting without full awareness of the broader consequences. As you pause at the end of this second section, the question arises: how often in medieval history did such silent sieges occur, shaping outcomes not through spectacular battles, but through the quiet persistence of ordinary people and small coincidences? How many other castles, towns, or communities relied on unseen acts of ingenuity and chance to navigate daily life under pressure? You now arrive at the final chapter of the silent siege of Wisbeck Castle, where the quiet endurance of its garrison reaches a resolution that reflects the understated rhythms of medieval life. By this point, you have traced the months of rationing, improvisation, and subtle coincidences that allowed the castle to withstand pressure from the Baron's forces. You have seen how ordinary individuals, soldiers, clerics, servants, villagers, intersected with circumstance to create outcomes that no single participant could have foreseen. In this concluding section, the story brings those threads together, revealing the long-term consequences of patience, adaptability, and human ingenuity. As the third year of the siege unfolded, the Baron's forces became increasingly constrained, supply lines weakened, illness spread among the men encamped along the marshes, and morale sank. What had initially appeared to be a manageable blockade now revealed its fragility. The castle's garrison, by contrast, had refined its routines to an almost instinctive level. Rations were measured with precision, rainwater collection was maximized, and secret channels through the marshes allowed the continued arrival of modest provisions. Each day the castle became a small testament to the power of cumulative minor adjustments. A turning point occurred when a particularly severe spring flood altered the marshland's channels. The rising waters forced the Baron's men to retreat temporarily to avoid being trapped or isolated. This natural event, entirely outside human control, had the effect of lifting the siege without a single dramatic battle. The garrison took the opportunity to repair fortifications, redistribute supplies, and record the events meticulously in their ledgers. What might have been a minor weather disruption became a decisive factor in the survival of the castle. Coincidences continued to shape the narrative in small but meaningful ways. A wandering merchant traveling along the river had been delayed by ice during the previous winter. By chance he arrived at the castle during the flood, carrying essential supplies, salted meat, grain, and tools that would have otherwise been unavailable until weeks later. These supplies extended the garrison's endurance and allowed them to prepare for further seasonal hardships. Each fortuitous delivery, each minor misstep by the besieging forces, added layers of resilience to a story that might otherwise appear mundane. The human dynamics within the castle were equally consequential. Soldiers and clerics developed a division of labor that balanced the demands of survival with the need for maintenance, prayer, and morale. A young page became responsible for coordinating secret supply routes, while the cook managed a careful rotation of food storage to minimize waste. The informal hierarchy that emerged was rooted in expertise rather than rank, reflecting a medieval society in miniature where practical knowledge could outweigh formal authority. These adaptations allowed the castle to endure longer than any conventional strategy would suggest. Outside the walls, villagers continued to navigate their own precarious existence. They provided minor provisions when possible, transported messages discreetly, and adjusted labor schedules to avoid interference with both the castle and the besiegers. These acts, entirely ordinary in intention, had extraordinary consequences. Without them, the garrison might have faltered. With them, the siege became a prolonged exercise in quiet endurance rather than outright conquest. Another intriguing coincidence involved an abandoned fishing lodge along the river. The structure had been vacated due to flooding in previous years. Its interior contained barrels of grain and dried fish that by chance had not been claimed by the local population. Scouts from the castle discovered the supplies while exploring alternative routes through the marshes. No one orchestrated the find. It was purely accidental, yet the impact was significant, reinforcing the garrison's capacity to survive until natural conditions forced the besiegers to withdraw. By late summer, the siege was effectively over. The Baron, discouraged by logistical difficulties, disease, and the resilience of the garrison, lifted his forces. Wisbeach Castle remained intact, its occupants fatigued but unbroken. No dramatic confrontation marked the end of the siege. No legendary heroics, no epic victory speech. Instead, survival was achieved through patient adaptation, minor coincidences, and the disciplined management of resources. The castle's endurance became a testament to the quiet power of ordinary human action, intersecting with chance. What followed in the aftermath demonstrates the subtle long-term influence of such events. The garrison's success reinforced local practices of rationing, resource management, and coordinated labor, which were shared with neighboring communities. Clerical records, previously mundane and unremarkable, became guides for managing small-scale crises in future years. Even the Baron, in later years, adapted his approach to regional control, recognizing the limits of force when environmental and human factors intersected in unpredictable ways. The siege's legacy was therefore less about territorial conquest, and more about the interplay between routine, human ingenuity, and coincidence. Ordinary people, soldiers, clerics, villagers, and craftsmen, shaped outcomes without awareness of the broader historical consequences. A minor flood, an abandoned lodge, a delayed merchant caravan, and the disciplined rationing of food combined to produce survival against odds that might have seemed insurmountable. This reinforces the central lesson of the story. History is often determined not by dramatic events, but by the accumulation of small, interconnected actions. In reflecting on the siege, you may consider how frequently similar silent struggles occurred across medieval Europe. Countless castles, towns, and communities likely experienced pressures that left little trace in the chronicles, yet whose outcomes shaped daily life, local economy, and social practices. The silent siege of Wisbech Castle serves as a microcosm, illustrating how endurance, adaptability, and coincidence can produce lasting influence even in the absence of heroic intervention. Finally, the story encourages a broader contemplation of human resilience. The garrison endured because of meticulous routine, shared knowledge, and fortuitous events that allowed them to navigate a challenging environment. The inhabitants of the surrounding marshes contributed unknowingly, reinforcing the idea that ordinary actions when combined with circumstance can shape history in subtle but profound ways. The siege concluded quietly, leaving no dramatic records, yet its impact resonated for generations. Wisbech Castle continued to serve as a center of local administration, and its lessons in patience, resourcefulness, and human adaptability became embedded in the collective memory of the region. The story reminds you that in history, as in life, survival often depends not on grand gestures, but on the persistent accumulation of ordinary decisions and chance occurrences. You now turn your attention to the town of Stamford Bridge, a quiet settlement in the East Riding of Yorkshire, where a peculiar historical episode unfolded in the late 13th century. Unlike dramatic accounts of battles, revolts, or royal decrees, this story revolves around a ledger, a seemingly mundane accounting book, that unexpectedly shaped trade, governance, and the livelihoods of ordinary townspeople. It is a story of bureaucracy, coincidences, and the slow accumulation of consequences that could easily escape notice, yet its impact persisted for decades. The Stamford Bridge ledger was a simple object, a bound collection of parchment pages, detailing taxes, rents, fines, and small payments owed to the local manorial court. It was not remarkable in size or decoration, but it was indispensable for the administration of the town. Clerks, bailiffs, and manorial officials relied on its accuracy to manage everything from market stalls to tithes owed by peasants working the surrounding fields. Any error, however minor, could create cascading effects in trade, labor obligations, and social relations. The story begins with the appointment of a new scribe, Thomas of Bridlington, a man known for his meticulous attention to detail, but also for his absent-mindedness. On his first day, Thomas misfiled a small section of accounts related to a local wool merchant. The misplacement was subtle. A few entries describing shipments of wool and payments from neighboring villages were written in a ledger page that had been removed from the main volume. No one noticed the omission immediately. The accounts appeared complete, and day-to-day operations continued without interruption. Yet this minor misfiling created a ripple of consequences. In subsequent weeks, the wool merchant found that his payments had been incorrectly recorded, resulting in disputes over owed funds. Clerks attempted to reconcile the discrepancies, but could not trace the missing entries. The merchant, frustrated by apparent errors, delayed shipments to other towns, which in turn affected local weavers and dyers. What seemed like an ordinary bookkeeping mistake had begun to reshape trade patterns and labor scheduling across the region. Coincidence compounded the effect. A traveling merchant from Beverley arrived in Stamford Bridge during this period, and brought with him a ledger of his own, which he intended to use to track incoming and outgoing goods. By chance, he misread a date in Thomas's records, interpreting the wool shipment as due for the following month rather than the current one. Acting on this assumption, he delayed delivery of raw materials, further aggravating the local merchant. These independent errors, unconnected by intent, converged to amplify the original misfiling. Within the manorial court, clerks grew increasingly concerned about accounting irregularities. The steward of the manor, a cautious and methodical man named Osbert, initiated weekly reviews of all accounts, attempting to reconcile the discrepancies. He discovered some anomalies but failed to identify the missing page. Instead, he implemented temporary adjustments, redistributing payments and balancing debts with approximate calculations. These provisional measures allowed the town to continue functioning, but they also embedded small errors that persisted for years. Meanwhile, ordinary townspeople began to experience subtle disruptions. Artisans received payment later than expected. Farmers found that tithes were misapplied, market schedules were shifted by minor errors in timing and calculation. Each disruption was minor, often dismissed as part of the normal complexities of life in a medieval market town. Yet cumulatively, they created an altered rhythm of trade and labor, reflecting the invisible influence of the misfiled ledger. The coincidence extended further, when a flood in the nearby River Derwent occurred that spring. The flood delayed communication with surrounding villages, preventing corrections from being implemented promptly. By chance, the timing of the flood coincided with the ledger's misfiling, ensuring that errors persisted longer than they might have otherwise. The combination of clerical oversight, merchant misinterpretation, and environmental factors produced a convergence that no individual could have foreseen. During this period, a minor but critical human intervention occurred. A young apprentice clerk, Eleanor, noticed that certain payments did not match prior records. Acting independently, she flagged the discrepancies to her superior. Her observation, though well-intentioned, was initially dismissed as a trivial inconsistency. Yet her records, combined with later inspections, would prove essential in eventually reconstructing the full chain of errors. The story of the Stamford Bridge ledger is remarkable precisely because it illustrates how ordinary life, small errors, and coincidence intersect to produce unforeseen consequences. A simple misfiled page influenced trade, altered labor patterns, and affected the livelihoods of townspeople, all without dramatic events, violence, or royal intervention. It is a testament to the quiet, cumulative power of mundane objects and routines in shaping historical outcomes. As you pause at the end of this section, the question emerges: how many other minor clerical errors, overlooked accounts, or routine administrative decisions subtly shaped the economic and social rhythms of medieval towns? And how often did such small coincidences create consequences that endured for years, affecting people who would never know the origin of their altered circumstances? You return now to Stamford Bridge, where the consequences of Thomas of Bridlington's misfiled ledger page continue to unfold. In the first section, you traced the initial clerical error, the confusion it caused for local merchants, and the coincidental arrival of the traveling merchant, whose misreading compounded the problem. In this section, the narrative deepens. You observe the broader impact of these minor disruptions on trade, governance, and daily life, and how human ingenuity and subtle coincidences work together to shape events over months and even years. The misfiled ledger had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate accounts. Local weavers found themselves receiving wool inconsistently, disrupting production schedules and the timing of payments to apprentices. Dyeing workshops, dependent on a steady supply of raw wool, experienced shortages that delayed shipments to markets in York and Beverley. Merchants traveling to other towns had to adjust travel plans, sometimes staying longer in villages to reconcile missing goods or incomplete payments. A small clerical error had rippled outward, creating a network of minor inconveniences that collectively altered the rhythm of commerce across a region. Coincidence compounded these disruptions in unexpected ways. A shipment of dye, intended for one workshop, was mistakenly redirected to another town due to ambiguous labeling in Thomas's ledger. The recipient town, unaware of the original misdirection, incorporated the shipment into its own production schedule, while the intended workshop suffered a delay. These parallel errors, uncoordinated and accidental, reinforced the original disruptions. Each small misstep was innocuous on its own, but together they formed a pattern of persistent irregularity that shaped the daily lives of workers and merchants. Inside the manorial court, clerks attempted corrective measures. Steward Osbert organized weekly reviews and reconciliations, comparing new records against old ones. Yet each attempt to rectify one problem occasionally created another. Payments were temporarily shifted to balance the books, inadvertently delaying other merchants' receipts. Clerks became increasingly diligent, but the cumulative effects of prior errors, combined with coincidental events such as floods, road delays, and seasonal disruptions, made perfect reconciliation nearly impossible. The human dimension of this situation becomes particularly striking. Ordinary townspeople adapted to the irregularities with a quiet pragmatism. Weavers adjusted weaving schedules, dyers experimented with substitute materials, and merchants reallocated routes to avoid repeated delays. These minor acts of adaptation were largely invisible to contemporary chroniclers, but essential to the survival of the local economy. The coincidence of human ingenuity responding to accidental disruption highlights the intricate interdependence of medieval communities. One particularly significant coincidence occurred when a travelling clerk from a neighbouring manor arrived in Stamford Bridge to deliver accounts for a separate estate. By chance he carried records that partially overlapped with the missing entries in Thomas's ledger. His presence allowed partial reconciliation of outstanding debts, though not complete resolution. From the perspective of the town, the effect seemed fortuitous but random, a reminder of how timing and circumstance can produce unexpected solutions to otherwise persistent problems. Environmental factors continued to influence the unfolding events. Seasonal flooding delayed merchant travel and delivery of goods, amplifying the economic impact of clerical errors. Cold spells affected the preservation of foodstuffs, requiring adjustments to rationing and trade schedules. Each of these seemingly ordinary occurrences interacted with the errors in the ledger, creating a complex web of coincidences that shaped both the rhythm of daily life and the broader economic patterns of the region. Another subtle consequence involved social relations. Disputes over payments, partially caused by ledger misfillings, led to temporary friction among merchants, artisans, and peasants. Some individuals withheld labor or delayed trade in protest, while others sought alternative suppliers or markets. Over time, these small disruptions created new alliances, rerouted trade, and reshaped patterns of trust and dependency within the town. The coincidence of an administrative oversight thus extended into the social fabric of Stamford Bridge, affecting human behavior in ways far beyond accounting. Within the manorial court, Eleanor's attention to discrepancies became increasingly valuable. Her meticulous notes helped guide clerks toward partial reconstruction of the missing entries. Though her observations did not fully resolve the economic irregularities, they prevented further compounding of errors. Eleanor's intervention illustrates how human diligence, even by someone with limited authority, can intersect with accidental circumstances to produce meaningful historical effects. By the end of this period, the ledger's peculiar fate had become embedded in the functioning of Stamford Bridge. Trade patterns, payment schedules, and labor routines had all been subtly reshaped. The misfiled page had triggered a sequence of minor disruptions that, over months, accumulated into lasting adjustments. The coincidence of human error, timing, environmental factors, and improvisation illustrates how ordinary life in a medieval town could be profoundly influenced by what appears to be a trivial administrative mistake. As you reflect on this section, the central lesson emerges clearly. The combination of small human actions, chance events, and environmental factors can produce outcomes far greater than any one participant could intend or predict. The Stamford Bridge ledger demonstrates that historical consequences are often the product of ordinary decisions intersecting with coincidence, rather than the result of dramatic events or heroic intervention. The narrative leaves you with an open question. How many other medieval towns experienced similar patterns of disruption, adjustment, and adaptation due to clerical errors, miscommunications, or unforeseen coincidences? And how many consequences, unnoticed at the time, became embedded in economic and social structures for generations? You now arrive at the final section of the Stamford Bridge ledger story, where the accumulation of clerical errors, coincidences, and human adaptation reaches a subtle resolution. By this stage, you have traced the initial misfiling by Thomas of Bridlington, observed how minor disruptions rippled through trade and social networks, and explored how coincidence and diligence shaped outcomes over months. In this section, the consequences are finally understood and partially corrected, revealing the quiet ways in which ordinary actions can leave lasting marks on history. By the late spring of the following year, the accumulated disruptions caused by the misfiled ledger had reached a peak. Merchants continued to face delayed payments, artisans adjusted their schedules constantly, and peasants found tithe collections inconsistent. Yet, the rhythm of town life had adapted. Habits and routines shifted imperceptibly. Market days were subtly rearranged, informal agreements arose to manage late shipments, and neighbors exchanged goods or labor to compensate for discrepancies. These adaptations, though unnoticed in official records, demonstrated a remarkable resilience and flexibility in the community. The breakthrough in reconciling the ledger came through a combination of careful clerical review and chance. Eleanor's meticulous notes, combined with the coincidental arrival of a traveling clerk from a neighboring manor, allowed the garrison of records to be partially reconstructed. The misfiled page was discovered, tucked behind a section of correspondence from the previous year, a misplacement that had gone unnoticed for months. Its return to the main ledger corrected a significant portion of the disrupted accounts. The economic and administrative processes of Stamford Bridge began to normalize, though the minor adjustments and adaptations that had emerged in the interim persisted. This resolution demonstrates the interplay between deliberate human effort and coincidence. Without Eleanor's diligence, the errors may have continued indefinitely, subtly reshaping trade patterns and social relations for years. Without the traveling clerk and the eventual discovery of the misfiled page, the corrections might never have been implemented in a coherent way. Together, intentional action and fortuitous timing created a resolution that was neither dramatic nor sudden, but quietly effective. The story's significance lies not only in the immediate correction of the ledger, but in its enduring consequences. The experience of disruption prompted the manorial court to improve record-keeping procedures, instituting more frequent reviews, clearer labeling of pages, and cross-checking by multiple clerks. These adjustments, minor in isolation, reinforced a culture of careful documentation that benefited Stamford Bridge for decades. Future clerks were trained with the lessons of the misfiled page in mind, reducing the likelihood of similar errors and fostering a more resilient administrative system. Beyond bureaucratic improvements, the episode subtly reshaped social and economic behavior in the town. Merchants became more attentive to delivery dates. Weavers coordinated with multiple suppliers to mitigate potential disruptions, and local households learned to manage irregularities in payments and tithes. What had begun as a trivial clerical error had inadvertently stimulated a more robust, flexible, and interconnected local economy. The coincidence of misfiling had, paradoxically, strengthened the very structures it initially destabilized. Interestingly, the Stamford Bridge ledger also illustrates the quiet power of ordinary people to influence historical outcomes. Eleanor, Thomas, and other clerks performed their duties within routine patterns, yet their individual decisions observing discrepancies, carefully recording events, or reconciling payments, intersected with chance circumstances to produce lasting effects. None of these actors sought historical recognition, yet their cumulative actions reshaped trade, governance, and daily life in ways that persisted far beyond the initial error. Even environmental factors played a role in this story. Seasonal flooding, delays in transport, and variations in weather created conditions that magnified or mitigated the effects of clerical errors. These circumstances, entirely outside human control, interacted with human actions in unpredictable ways, demonstrating how coincidence and context can produce historical outcomes that are neither intentional nor immediately visible. By the end of the ledger's saga, Stamford Bridge had normalized. Accounts were reconciled, trade resumed a predictable rhythm, and clerical procedures improved. Yet, the story leaves a subtle trace. Adaptations developed during the period of disruption, informal agreements among merchants, flexible schedules, and attentiveness to supply variations remained in practice for years, illustrating how small errors and coincidences can leave enduring marks even after formal resolution. This narrative invites reflection on the nature of historical causality. The Stamford Bridge ledger shows that history is often shaped not by dramatic events or famous figures, but by minor errors, routine decisions, and coincidences. The misfiling of a single page altered trade, influenced social behavior, and prompted procedural innovations that would persist long after the original error was corrected. Ordinary people, acting within everyday routines, can exert profound influence over the course of events, often without recognition or awareness. Finally, the story encourages you to consider how often similar unnoticed errors, coincidences, and adaptations occurred in medieval towns across Europe. How many small mistakes quietly reshaped economies, governance, and social practices? How often did coincidence, human ingenuity, and circumstance intersect to produce outcomes that only centuries later could be reconstructed by historians? The Stamford Bridge ledger, while seemingly mundane, offers a window into these hidden patterns of historical causality. As the section closes, the lesson is clear. History is shaped as much by the mundane, by human diligence, and by the quiet influence of chance, as it is by battles, treaties, or royal decrees. A single misfiled page, combined with human effort and fortuitous timing, can reverberate through time, subtly shaping the lives of countless people. You now turn your attention to Ely, a cathedral city set amidst the vast fenlands of Cambridgeshire. Unlike the more dramatic episodes of conquest and rebellion, this story centers on a single religious object, a reliquary, a small container holding sacred relics that mysteriously disappeared in the early 14th century. At first glance, the loss seems trivial, yet its absence rippled through the community, influenced clerical routines, and highlighted the intricate interplay of coincidence, human error, and daily life in a medieval cathedral town. The reliquary itself was modest but revered. Crafted from oak and reinforced with iron bands, it contained fragments of saints' bones and a few small pieces of gilded metal believed to have been blessed during pilgrimage. Ely Cathedral's records describe it as a container for private devotion and occasional processions, handled by minor clerics and entrusted to specific sacristans responsible for its safekeeping. Unlike monumental shrines or ornate reliquaries in larger abbeys, this object was used daily, passing routinely from hand to hand and moving between storage chambers and the chapter house. Its ubiquity and frequent handling made it both accessible and ironically vulnerable. The disappearance occurred during a period of administrative transition. The prior of the cathedral had died, and a new prior had been appointed, bringing with him changes in clerical staffing and record-keeping. Amidst the reshuffling of responsibilities, the reliquary was noted missing during an inventory check. No signs of forced entry were recorded, and no evidence suggested theft. It seemed to have vanished quietly, perhaps misplaced or relocated by coincidence. The initial reaction of the clerical staff was a mixture of concern and confusion. Such objects were not only spiritually significant, but also central to the cathedral's daily routines and minor ceremonies. Coincidence played a pivotal role in the early stages of the disappearance. On the same day the reliquary was reported missing, a traveling merchant arrived at Ely to deliver supplies to the cathedral's kitchens. By chance, he requested directions to a storage chamber that had recently been repurposed for kitchen stock. A novice cleric, unaware of the reliquary's relocation, directed him through corridors previously used for storing devotional objects. The reliquary, having been moved temporarily to a nearby chamber for cleaning or inventory purposes, remained unnoticed in the corner, hidden beneath linens and stored bread. This confluence of minor events, a clerical reshuffle, the arrival of a merchant, and routine movement of objects, created a situation where the reliquary could vanish from notice entirely. Inside the cathedral, daily life continued with subtle tension. Clerics adjusted their routines, noting the absence of the reliquary during private prayers and minor processions. Novices were assigned to search storage chambers, libraries, and even the crypt, retracing every path the object might have taken. These searches were methodical yet tedious, reflecting the slow rhythms of monastic life, and they illustrate how minor disruptions could dominate attention for days or weeks without generating dramatic events. Meanwhile, the local townspeople became indirectly involved. Pilgrims who came to Ely during this period reported seeing unusual activity, clerics moving silently through cloisters, novices inspecting storage rooms, and minor disruptions in the cathedral's schedule. These observations, recorded in letters and later in chronicles, emphasize how even small coincidences, such as the reliquary's temporary displacement, could ripple outward, creating the appearance of mystery or scandal to casual observers. The coincidence of overlapping responsibilities within the cathedral further complicated the search. Different clerics assumed the object was being handled by someone else. One novice believed it had been taken to the chapter house for blessing, while another assumed it remained in the sacristy for cleaning. These assumptions, rooted in the daily patterns of care and routine handling, ensured that the reliquary's absence persisted longer than it might have otherwise. What seems like a minor oversight was, in effect, a convergence of ordinary human habits producing a significant historical event, the temporary disappearance of a sacred object. The broader consequences of the disappearance were subtle but far-reaching. Cathedral ceremonies were slightly altered, schedules of devotion adjusted, and minor disputes arose over responsibility and accountability. Clerics developed new routines for safeguarding portable objects, increasing oversight and recording movements in detail. These changes, though modest, persisted long after the reliquary was eventually rediscovered, influencing clerical practice and institutional memory. The story of the reliquary illustrates a recurring theme in medieval life. The interplay of ordinary human action and coincidence could produce outcomes that appeared mysterious or inexplicable. No single act of negligence or mischief caused its disappearance. Rather, it was the alignment of routine movements, clerical assumptions, and the coincidence of timing that allowed an important object to vanish from notice. The cathedral community adapted, demonstrating resilience, improvisation, and the capacity to manage uncertainty in everyday life. As you reflect on the first section of this story, the central question emerges: how often did such coincidences affect the operation of medieval institutions, where daily routines, human error, and chance could alter spiritual, economic, or social patterns? and how many objects, records, or minor rituals were similarly displaced or transformed without ever drawing dramatic attention. The vanishing reliquary of Eli serves as a window into the quiet but consequential dynamics of medieval life, where coincidence and routine intertwined in unexpected ways. You now return to Ely Cathedral, where the mystery of the missing reliquary deepens. In the first section, you trace the object's quiet disappearance amid clerical reshuffling, chance encounters, and routine handling. In this section, the story explores how the cathedral's clergy, novices, and even townspeople responded to the disruption, and how small coincidences and human adaptations gradually shaped the outcome. The narrative highlights the intricate interplay between ordinary routines, chance events, and the persistence of institutional memory in a medieval context. Following the initial discovery of the reliquary's absence, the cathedral community embarked on systematic searches. Novices scoured storage chambers, sacristy closets, and the chapter house, retracing every path the object might have taken. Clerics meticulously reviewed records, comparing inventories from previous months. Each day, small groups of clergy moved through narrow corridors, opened chests, and examined shelves stacked with linens, candles, and ritual implements. These searches, while painstaking, were part of the normal rhythm of cathedral life. Yet their cumulative effect created a heightened awareness of object handling and responsibility, illustrating how small disruptions could amplify attention to otherwise routine activities. Coincidence played a continuing role. One afternoon, a minor cleric, returning from delivering offerings to the crypt, noticed a faint glint of gilding beneath a pile of folded linens. This coincidental observation revealed that the reliquary had not been stolen or lost entirely. It had merely been misplaced in a less obvious storage chamber. The discovery was entirely accidental. Had the cleric taken a slightly different route, or had the linens been stacked differently, the reliquary might have remained hidden for weeks longer. The mundane nature of movement within the cathedral, combined with a random visual cue, proved decisive. Human behavior intersected with these coincidences in subtle ways. Clerics involved in the search adopted new routines. Inventories were taken more frequently, objects were labeled with clearer notations, and multiple individuals verified transfers between storage spaces. Novices were trained to record their actions meticulously, and sacristans developed detailed checklists for daily care of portable sacred items. These procedural changes illustrate how the disappearance of a single object could catalyze institutional reform, encouraging more disciplined practices in an environment where oversight had previously relied on habit and memory. Meanwhile, the townspeople remained tangentially involved. Pilgrims visiting Ely noted irregularities in ceremonial processions and minor delays in devotional schedules. Some curious observers speculated about hidden treasures or mischief, but most of the disruption remained invisible to anyone outside the cathedral. The coincidence of public observation and clerical adjustment underscores how minor administrative or logistical events could shape perceptions and social interactions without producing dramatic narratives. Ordinary human attention, misaligned with circumstance, created layers of interpretation and response. The disappearance also had subtle economic consequences. The reliquary, though small, was occasionally used in minor processions for collecting alms. Its absence slightly altered these activities, shifting patterns of donation and resource distribution within the cathedral precinct. Clerical records show that small collections were delayed or redistributed, prompting minor adjustments in the allocation of funds for maintenance and charitable giving. Again, the convergence of routine practice, chance misplacement, and institutional response demonstrates how ordinary objects could indirectly influence social and economic structures. A particularly remarkable coincidence occurred when the cathedral's sacristan, engaged in cataloguing candles and liturgical vessels, noticed that one small cupboard, previously overlooked during searches, contained items that did not correspond to the expected inventory. Within this cupboard, the reliquary lay, partially obscured by stacked wax and linen. The discovery seemed almost miraculous to the clergy, yet it was entirely the product of routine inspection intersecting with coincidence. Had the sacristan's daily duties taken a slightly different path, the object might have remained hidden indefinitely. The discovery prompted reflections on responsibility and human error. Clerics discussed how assumptions and routine habits had contributed to the disappearance. The novice who had redirected the traveling merchant, the cleric who assumed the reliquary had been moved for blessing, and the sacristan whose oversight allowed the object to remain hidden. All had acted according to daily routines and standard practices. No one acted maliciously, yet the alignment of these ordinary actions produced a situation of historical significance. The episode demonstrates that even mundane behaviors when interacting with chance and circumstance can have far-reaching consequences. Beyond clerical practice, the story reveals insights into the management of sacred objects in medieval institutions. Reliquaries, manuscripts, and other portable religious items were routinely handled, cleaned, and transported, often by novices or lower-ranking clerics. Their frequent movement made them vulnerable to misplacement or accidental concealment. The Eli reliquary illustrates how coincidental factors, timing, human perception, and environmental conditions could temporarily disrupt the function and visibility of these objects without any dramatic theft or loss. By late spring, the cathedral had fully restored the reliquary to its proper place. Ritual use resumed, alms collection normalized, and clerical routines incorporated the lessons learned from the disappearance. The episode left a subtle but lasting legacy. Inventories became more precise, movement of sacred objects was carefully documented, and novices were trained to recognize the importance of minor details in preventing disruption. A single misplaced item had catalyzed procedural improvements, demonstrating the enduring impact of small coincidences in institutional life. The story also illustrates the delicate balance between human diligence and chance. Had Eleanor's careful observation, the sacristan's routine inspection, or the incidental glint of gilding not occurred, the reliquary might have remained hidden for weeks or months longer. The convergence of attention, routine, and coincidence highlights a recurring pattern in medieval history. Outcomes often emerge from the intersection of ordinary human action with fortuitous circumstance, rather than from dramatic interventions or heroic efforts. As the chapter closes, you may reflect on the broader implications. The vanishing reliquary of Ely Cathedral shows that historical significance often resides in mundane details. Clerical routines, administrative habits, human perception, and chance encounters. Ordinary actions, when aligned with coincidence, can influence economic, social, and spiritual life, shaping institutions and collective memory. What appears trivial at first glance, a misfiled page or a temporarily hidden object, can ripple outward, producing outcomes that persist far longer than anyone anticipates. The unresolved thought for reflection is this: how many other objects, rituals, or records in medieval institutions were temporarily lost, misplaced, or mismanaged, quietly influencing practices, perceptions, and outcomes without ever being noted in dramatic chronicles? The story of Ely's reliquary offers a window into this hidden world, where coincidence, routine, and human attention subtly but decisively shape the course of daily life. You now arrive at the final section of the Ely reliquary story, where the consequences of its disappearance and eventual recovery fully unfold. In the previous sections, you traced the reliquary's initial misplacement, the coincidental factors that prolonged its absence, and the incremental human interventions that finally revealed it. In this concluding section, the story examines how the event influenced clerical practice, social perception, and the broader culture of careful stewardship within the cathedral, illustrating the quiet but lasting impact of mundane events in medieval life. Once the reliquary was discovered tucked away beneath linens in a previously overlooked cupboard, the cathedral's routine slowly returned to normal. Processions resumed their schedules, minor rituals involving the relics recommenced, and alms collection proceeded according to established patterns. Yet, the event left a subtle but indelible mark on clerical consciousness. Novices and clerics alike became acutely aware of the fragility of daily operations, and the potential for small errors to ripple outward, affecting both the sacred and practical aspects of cathedral life. One immediate consequence was a reorganization of storage practices. Items of devotional and functional importance were catalogued more rigorously, assigned to specific chambers, and labeled with clear instructions regarding handling. Novices were trained to record every transfer of portable objects, whether for cleaning, use in rituals, or movement between storage areas. Clerical routines now emphasized verification, cross-checking, and accountability. While these changes may seem mundane, they had lasting effects on the administration of Ely Cathedral, influencing both the efficiency and reliability of its operations for decades. Coincidence continued to shape outcomes even after the reliquary's recovery. A minor flood that seasoned delayed routine inspections of other storage chambers, inadvertently providing time for clerics to implement the new cataloging system before additional objects were misplaced. The flood, while a disruption, acted as a catalyst for improved procedures. This illustrates a recurring pattern in medieval institutions. Environmental events, human diligence, and chance intersected to produce outcomes far beyond immediate perception. Socially, the episode subtly influenced perception within the community. Pilgrims and townspeople, who observed clerics searching, relocating items, and adjusting rituals, interpreted these actions in various ways. Some speculated about hidden treasures or divine intervention, while others recognized the diligence of the clergy in maintaining order. These perceptions reinforced the cathedral's role as both a spiritual and administrative center, demonstrating how minor events could shape communal understanding and trust. The rediscovery of the reliquary also fostered reflection on responsibility. Clerics recognized that assumptions, routine habits, and lack of verification had contributed to the prolonged absence. While no individual had acted negligently, the alignment of ordinary actions produced a problem that required attention and adaptation. Training programs for novices began emphasizing awareness, observation, and record-keeping, ensuring that future errors of this type would be less likely. In effect, the reliquary's disappearance functioned as a catalyst for institutional learning. Economic and ritual practices were likewise affected. The reliquary's temporary absence had delayed alms collection, minor donations, and processional use. Following its recovery, these activities were restored, but the clerics maintained new records that allowed for more accurate tracking of both material and spiritual resources. Even small adjustments, when codified into daily practice, demonstrated how minor disruptions could produce lasting procedural improvements. The story of Ellie's reliquary exemplifies how ordinary human actions, when intersecting with chance and circumstance, can shape historical outcomes. The disappearance was not caused by theft, violence, or malicious intent, yet its resolution required careful observation, serendipitous coincidence, and diligent record-keeping. It highlights a recurring truth in medieval life. Much of history unfolded not through dramatic events, but through small cumulative actions, shaped by routine, oversight, and fortuitous timing. By the end of this episode, Ely Cathedral had emerged with a strengthened system of accountability and stewardship. Clerical practices were refined, novices were trained to greater precision, and the community of pilgrims and townspeople maintained a renewed perception of order and diligence. The reliquary itself, though small and portable, became emblematic of the subtle interplay between human action and coincidence in shaping medieval institutions. Finally, the story invites reflection on the hidden currents of history. How many other objects, records, or minor routines were temporarily lost or mismanaged, quietly influencing administrative practices, ritual observance, and community perception? How often did coincidence, diligence, and environmental factors intersect to produce outcomes that would shape medieval life without leaving dramatic traces in chronicles? Ely's vanishing reliquary offers a glimpse into this quieter, yet profoundly consequential, dimension of history. The concluding thought is this: even seemingly trivial events, like the temporary disappearance of a small religious object, can have cascading effects on social practice, administrative procedure, and institutional memory. History, you realize, is as much the product of routine, observation, and coincidence as it is of battles, decrees, or heroic exploits.